Welcome, gentle seekers of crimson wisdom, to the shadowed realm where blood flows like ancient rivers through veins both human and monstrous. Tonight, we delve into the deepest mysteries of blood demon arts, those supernatural manifestations born from suffering and transformation that define the eternal war between light and darkness. Each technique we explore represents not merely a weapon, but a window into souls that have crossed the threshold from humanity into something far more complex and terrible. So settle beneath your covers like autumn leaves falling to forest floors, and let the rhythm of your breathing carry you into peaceful slumber as we traverse the crimson tapestry of power that flows through demon veins, beginning with the source from which all such arts spring forth. In the beginning, there was only darkness, and within that primordial void, a single moment of transformation would echo through centuries like a stone cast into still waters, its ripples expanding outward to touch countless lives with the blessing and curse of supernatural power. More than 1,000 years ago, when the world was younger, and the boundary between human and monster had not yet been carved by blood and tears, the first demon came into being through circumstances that history has painted in shadows and whispers, carrying within his transformed flesh the seed of every blood demon art that would follow in the endless nights to come. Kibutsuji Muzan, whose name would become synonymous with terror, and whose existence would define the very nature of what it meant to be demon. Possessed within his altered form, the primordial blood demon art, from which all others would spring like branches from a corrupted tree. His biokinesis, that fundamental manipulation of flesh and bone and sinew, represented not merely a supernatural ability, but the very essence of demonic transformation itself, the power to reshape reality through will made manifest in living tissue that responded to thought as readily as clay responds to the potter's hands. The biokinetic mastery that Muzan wielded transcended every limitation that human form had ever imposed upon consciousness, allowing him to alter his appearance with the same casual ease that ordinary people might change their clothing, shifting features and proportions according to need or whim, while maintaining perfect control over every aspect of his physical manifestation. His face could become that of a distinguished businessman, a beautiful woman, or an innocent child, each transformation so complete that even those who knew his true nature might pass him on crowded streets without recognition, never suspecting that death itself walked among them wearing borrowed flesh. But the surface alterations that enabled his countless disguises represented merely the most superficial application of powers that extended deep into the fundamental architecture of his being, as Muzan had remade his internal anatomy according to principles that defied every assumption about how living creatures were meant to function. Where humans possessed single hearts that beat with mortal rhythm, he had crafted for himself 7 cardiac organs that pumped demonic blood through circulatory systems whose complexity exceeded anything nature had ever produced through evolution's patient process. The 5 brains that governed his consciousness operated in harmonious coordination that enabled thought processes of impossible sophistication, each neural cluster contributing its unique capabilities to decision-making and sensory analysis that occurred simultaneously across multiple levels of awareness. This distributed intelligence provided not only enhanced cognitive function, but crucial redundancy that made conventional decapitation techniques largely ineffective, as the destruction of any single brain would merely reduce his capabilities temporarily, while the remaining organs adapted to compensate for the loss. These anatomical modifications served purposes that extended far beyond simple enhancement of natural abilities, creating defensive systems that could preserve his existence against attacks that would prove instantly fatal to creatures bound by normal biological constraints. The strategic placement of hearts and brains throughout his body meant that would-be executioners would need to destroy multiple vital organs simultaneously to achieve permanent elimination, a requirement that made successful assassination exponentially more difficult than conventional demon-slaying procedures could normally achieve. The regenerative capabilities that emerged from this multiplied anatomy operated at speeds that transformed what should have been mortal wounds into temporary inconveniences as damaged tissue rebuilt itself according to patterns stored within his distributed consciousness, while backup organs maintained essential functions that would have ceased in normally constructed bodies. Even wounds that destroyed entire sections of his torso could be repaired within moments, new flesh growing to replace what had been lost, while his consciousness never wavered from whatever task demanded his attention. Yet these defensive applications of biokinesis paled in comparison to the offensive possibilities that such complete control over his physical form enabled, as Muzan could reshape his limbs into weapons whose lethality exceeded anything conventional craftsmanship could produce. His arms extended into whip-like appendages whose reach spanned impossible distances while maintaining the strength to shatter stone and steel, each movement precise enough to thread needles or devastating enough to demolish buildings, depending on the situation's requirements. The creation of bone and flesh weapons from his own body represented alchemy of the most fundamental sort, transforming living tissue into implements of destruction that combined organic flexibility with metallic hardness in ways that conventional materials could never replicate. Tubes and whips emerged from his spine and legs according to tactical need, their hollow interiors serving as channels for delivering poisons or projectiles, while their exterior surfaces bore cutting edges sharp enough to slice through the enhanced steel of Nichiren blades. When threatened or cornered, Muzan's panic could trigger transformations so dramatic that his normal human appearance became unrecognizable, his flesh swelling and distorting until he resembled some primordial creature whose form followed no earthly template. The gigantic infant configuration that he adopted when faced with the threat of sunlight represented perhaps the most disturbing application of his biokinetic mastery, as familiar human proportions stretched and altered until they became something simultaneously infantile and monstrous, protective and threatening. This grotesque defensive posture served the practical purpose of increasing his total body mass, while concentrating vital organs within layers of flesh thick enough to potentially survive brief exposure to solar radiation. Yet the psychological impact of such transformation created additional tactical advantages as opponents struggled to reconcile their expectations of combat against a humanoid figure with the reality of facing something whose appearance defied categorization. The ability to separate himself into hundreds of individual pieces that retained independent mobility represented perhaps the ultimate expression of biokinetic mastery, as each fragment maintained sufficient consciousness to execute complex maneuvers while possessing the capability to regenerate into complete copies of his original form given adequate time and resources. This division technique enabled escape strategies that made permanent elimination nearly impossible, as even the complete destruction of his apparent main body might leave dozens of hidden fragments free to rebuild themselves in safety. The coordinated movement of these flesh puppets created tactical scenarios that challenged every assumption about how individual opponents should behave during combat encounters, as what appeared to be single adversary could suddenly become small army, whose every member possessed identical capabilities and shared consciousness. The psychological warfare potential of such multiplication was enormous, as opponents who believed they had gained advantage over Lone Demon would suddenly find themselves outnumbered by creatures whose coordination exceeded anything human teamwork could achieve. The reattachment process that allowed separated pieces to merge back into unified form operated through mechanisms that transcended conventional understanding of how biological systems maintain structural integrity. As flesh recognized flesh across any distance while gravitating toward reunion with magnetic inevitability. Wounds that would leave permanent scars on normal bodies healed without trace once the separated tissue had been restored to its proper position, creating seamless repair that left no evidence of previous damage. The blood demon art that enabled such extraordinary manipulations drew its power from sources that remained mysterious, even to Muzan himself, as the transformation that had granted him these abilities had occurred through circumstances beyond his control or complete understanding. The medicine that had changed him from dying human into immortal demon had unlocked potentials that human flesh had always possessed but never accessed, revealing capabilities that evolution had left dormant within cellular structures that responded to will in ways that normal consciousness could never achieve. The corruption that accompanied such power manifested not merely in his appetite for human flesh, but in the fundamental alteration of his relationship to existence itself, as immortality, combined with supernatural capability, created perspective that valued individual human lives no more highly than insects, deserved consideration from creatures whose lifespans and powers elevated them to different category of being. The casual cruelty that characterized his interactions with both humans and demons reflected not sadistic pleasure, but complete indifference to suffering that no longer seemed significant when measured against eternal existence. Yet within this transformation lay the seeds of every blood demon art that would follow, as each demon he created carried fragments of his biokinetic mastery expressed according to their individual natures and psychological characteristics. The thread manipulation that would define Rui's combat style, the spatial distortion that enabled Nakime's architectural impossibilities, the elemental controls that granted others mastery over fire and ice and lightning, all represented facets of the fundamental power to reshape reality through will applied to matter that Muzan had pioneered through his original transformation. The hierarchy that emerged among demons reflected not merely differences in consumed human flesh, but variations in how completely each individual had managed to access and develop the biokinetic potential that Muzan's blood had awakened within their transformed bodies. Those who achieved upper moon status had learned to channel their inherited power with precision and creativity that elevated their abilities far beyond simple enhancement of natural characteristics toward genuine artistry in supernatural manipulation. The training and experimentation that such development required occurred over decades and centuries of existence, as each demon gradually discovered the specific applications of biokinetic control that suited their personality and combat preferences, while pushing their inherited abilities toward expressions that even Muzan might not have anticipated when their transformations first occurred. The diversity of blood demon arts that eventually emerged testified to the vast potential that lay dormant within the fundamental power he had discovered. The irony that bound even the Demon King remained his vulnerability to sunlight, that primal force which could reduce his accumulated power to ash within moments. Despite all his biological mastery and supernatural capability, the fear that daylight inspired in him drove much of his strategic thinking and shaped his approach to conflicts that might otherwise have been resolved through direct application of overwhelming force, creating tactical constraints that his enemies could exploit despite their inferior individual capabilities. This single weakness served as reminder that even ultimate power remained subject to natural law, that transformation could grant extraordinary abilities while leaving fundamental vulnerabilities unchanged from the original human condition that no amount of biokinetic mastery could completely overcome. The sun that warmed ordinary humans and enabled all life on Earth remained the one force that could destroy him instantly, maintaining cosmic balance that prevented any single entity from achieving truly absolute dominion over existence itself. And so the Demon King, who had birthed all blood demon arts through his own transformation, remained paradoxically limited by the very forces that had enabled his ascension, creating dynamic tension between ultimate power and ultimate vulnerability that would define every aspect of the supernatural war that followed his emergence into the world of humans, who had no idea that their most fundamental assumptions about reality were about to be shattered by forces beyond their comprehension or resistance. The realm of blood demon arts encompasses abilities that transcend simple physical enhancement, reaching into territories where the very fabric of reality becomes malleable to demonic will. And nowhere is this more profoundly demonstrated than in those rare and terrifying powers that transform environment itself into weapon, sanctuary, and prison all at once. These spatial manipulators, masters of architectural impossibility and geometric nightmare, represent perhaps the most psychologically disturbing category of blood demon arts, because they violate humanity's most fundamental assumptions about the reliability of physical space and the permanence of the world around us. Among these reality-bending artists, few names inspire more unease than Kyogai, the drum demon whose mansion became a living instrument of torment through his ability to reshape interior space according to rhythms that followed no earthly logic. His blood demon art, known simply as drumming, transformed what should have been static architecture into dynamic battlefield where walls became floors, floors became ceilings, and the very concept of orientation lost all meaning through supernatural percussion that rewrote physical law with each thunderous beat. The 6 drums that Kyogai bore, embedded within his flesh at strategic points across his torso and limbs, served as both instruments and control mechanisms, their hide surfaces bearing mystical patterns that seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy whenever his clawed fingers struck them in combinations that unleashed specific effects upon his surrounding environment. Each drum commanded different aspects of spatial manipulation, from rotation and translation to dimensional folding, that defied every assumption about how 3-dimensional space was supposed to function according to natural law. The drum positioned upon his right shoulder possessed the power to rotate entire rooms clockwise around invisible axes that passed through their geometric centers, transforming floors into walls and walls into ceilings, while furniture, debris, and unwary occupants tumbled through space that obeyed no consistent gravitational reference. The sensation of standing within a room undergoing such rotation created vertigo so profound that even experienced demon slayers found their combat effectiveness severely compromised by the simple inability to maintain stable footing or predict which surface would next serve as ground. Conversely, the drum embedded in his left shoulder controlled counterclockwise rotation that could reverse previous transformations or create complex spinning motions that combined multiple axes of revolution to generate spatial effects so disorienting that victims often lost track not only of their physical position, but of basic concepts like up and down, left and right, forward and backward. The strategic application of alternating rotations could trap opponents in endless cycles of reorientation that prevented them from mounting effective attacks, while leaving them vulnerable to assaults from angles that changed faster than conscious thought could adapt. The stomach drum that occupied Kyogai's central torso unleashed entirely different category of spatial attack through techniques that manifested as 3 parallel slashes of compressed air, sharp enough to cut through stone and steel, while traveling at velocities that made evasion nearly impossible within enclosed spaces. These cutting attacks emerged from the drum's surface as invisible force that carved through intervening matter along perfectly straight lines regardless of obstacles, creating wounds that seemed to appear spontaneously on targets who had no opportunity to observe or counter the attacks that caused them. The precision with which these aerial slashes could be directed allowed Kyogai to strike opponents from any position within his mansion, regardless of walls, furniture, or other barriers that might normally provide protection, as his attacks passed through solid matter while retaining their lethal cutting power until they encountered living tissue. The psychological impact of wounds that appeared without visible cause added layer of terror to combat encounters that were already complicated by constantly shifting environmental conditions. The most strategically significant of Kyogai's drum's occupied position upon his back, its activation triggering instantaneous teleportation effects that could transport himself or other individuals to different rooms within his mansion, according to his tactical needs and desires. This spatial displacement occurred without transition period or intermediate stage, as subjects simply vanished from their current location and appeared elsewhere within the building's confines, as if they had never existed in the intervening space. The applications of such teleportation capability extended far beyond simple repositioning, as Kyogai could separate opponents who relied on mutual support while placing himself at optimal range for attacks that his enemies could neither predict nor prepare for adequately. The ability to appear behind targets who believed themselves safely positioned, to escape from disadvantageous engagements by vanishing instantaneously, or to transport particularly dangerous opponents to rooms specifically prepared as traps made him formidable adversary, whose tactical options exceeded anything conventional combat training could adequately address. Perhaps most disturbing of all Kyogai's spatial abilities was his personal immunity to the effects of his own room rotation, as he remained perfectly oriented relative to the original floor surface, regardless of how dramatically the chamber around him might be spinning or tumbling through impossible angles. This selective gravity effect enabled him to move with normal coordination and attack precision, while his enemies struggled with basic locomotion, creating combat scenarios where his opponents fought as much against environmental chaos as against his direct assaults. The implications of such environmental immunity extended beyond simple tactical advantage toward fundamental questions about the nature of space itself within his domain, as the same physical laws that constrained his enemies apparently did not apply to his own movement and positioning. Whether this immunity resulted from his supernatural nature or represented conscious application of his blood demon art remained unclear, yet its practical effect was to transform every room within his mansion into an arena where he possessed inherent advantage that no amount of skill or preparation could completely overcome. The mansion that served as framework for Kyogai's spatial manipulations had been architecturally modified through decades of experimentation with his blood demon art. Its rooms and corridors designed specifically to maximize the disorienting effects of his drumming while providing optimal acoustics for the supernatural percussion that enabled his reality warping abilities. The building's interior followed no conventional floor plan, with chambers connected through passages that formed three-dimensional maze where traditional navigation methods proved utterly inadequate. Each room within this labyrinthine structure possessed unique characteristics that complemented different applications of Kyogai's spatial control, from circular chambers that enhanced rotational effects to elongated corridors that maximized the range and impact of his cutting attacks. The positioning of windows, doorways, and architectural features had been carefully planned to create maximum confusion among visitors while providing Kyogai with clear lines of sight and attack vectors that his enemies could not easily predict or counter. The acoustic properties that the mansion's design incorporated served essential function in amplifying and focusing the supernatural vibrations that Kyogai's drumming generated, as the building itself acted as resonance chamber that transformed ordinary percussion into reality-altering force. The walls and floors had been constructed with materials and proportions that enhanced specific frequencies while dampening others, creating selective amplification that increased his power while reducing the risk that his own abilities might damage structural integrity of his domain. Yet, even as Kyogai's mastery over architectural space represented pinnacle of environmental manipulation, his abilities seemed almost modest when compared to the reality-warping powers wielded by Nakime, the upper moon demon whose blood demon art transcended simple room rotation to encompass creation of entire alternate dimensions, structured according to supernatural principles that violated every assumption about how space and distance were supposed to function. Nakime's Infinity Castle stood as monument to architectural impossibility, its countless rooms and corridors extending through spatial relationships that followed no earthly logic, while providing her with absolute control over every aspect of the environment that existed within its boundaries. The structure itself seemed to exist partially outside normal space, accessible only through portal techniques that she controlled, while remaining invisible to ordinary observation methods that might otherwise have revealed its presence to human authorities. The Baiwa that Nakime wielded as both musical instrument and control mechanism for her spatial abilities produced sounds that were simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, each note corresponding to specific alterations in the castle's internal geography, while creating harmonious melodies that seemed to emerge from the architecture itself. The strings of her instrument responded to supernatural touch that could generate frequencies beyond normal human hearing, their vibrations resonating through dimensional barriers to reshape reality according to patterns that followed musical rather than geometric logic. The rooms within Nakime's domain multiplied and divided according to need, their number theoretically infinite while their arrangement remained subject to constant revision through her musical commands. Chambers could be created instantly to house new arrivals, expanded to accommodate large gatherings, or contracted to crush unwanted occupants, all through manipulation of spatial parameters that treated distance and volume as variables to be adjusted rather than fixed constants that constrained architectural possibility. The staircases that connected different levels within the Infinity Castle followed paths that seemed to lead simultaneously upward and downward, their steps arranged in patterns that created optical illusions while providing genuine transportation between floors that might exist in entirely different dimensional frameworks. Walking these stairs produced sensations of movement in multiple directions at once, as travelers found themselves ascending toward destinations that appeared to be below their starting point while descending toward locations that seemed positioned overhead. The tatami sliding doors that served as Nakime's primary method for creating portals could appear anywhere within her domain according to her will, their wooden frames materializing from empty air, while their paper panels revealed glimpses of distant rooms or external locations that might be hundreds of miles away from the castle's apparent position. These doorways provided instantaneous transportation that ignored conventional limitations of distance and terrain, enabling strategic deployment of personnel and resources according to tactical requirements that no normal transportation system could satisfy. The defensive applications of such portal mastery made Nakime's castle nearly impregnable to conventional assault, as attacking forces could find themselves scattered across dozens of separate chambers, while their coordinated tactics were neutralized through strategic separation that prevented mutual support between team members. The ability to redirect attacks through dimensional doorways meant that offensive techniques aimed at Nakime might instead strike her enemies, turning their own power against them through spatial manipulation that required no physical effort on her part. The surveillance capabilities that her architectural control provided extended throughout every corner of her domain, as she could observe activities in any room while remaining invisible to those being watched through one-way spatial connections that transmitted visual and auditory information without creating detectable openings. This omniscient awareness within her own territory made surprise attacks nearly impossible, while providing intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions that could guide tactical decisions with perfect information about opposing forces. Yet even Nakime's reality-warping castle paled before the aquatic nightmares conjured by Gyoko. The upper moon demon, whose blood demon art transformed porcelain vessels into gateways for horrors that emerged from depths that existed beyond normal understanding of marine biology. His vase-based abilities combined artistic sensibility with predatory efficiency, creating techniques that were simultaneously beautiful and deadly through their integration of aesthetic principles with supernatural power. The porcelain pots that served as focal points for Gyoko's blood demon art could be manifested anywhere within his operational range, their surfaces bearing intricate designs that seemed to shift and change according to his emotional state, while their hollow interiors connected to dimensions where water and marine creatures existed according to rules that differed from earthly oceanography. Each vase represented portal to aquatic realm whose inhabitants had been shaped by demonic influence into forms that exceeded natural evolution's most extreme experiments. The fish-like creatures that emerged from these ceramic gateways bore only superficial resemblance to any species that inhabited normal waters, their anatomical features combining elements from different orders of sea life, while incorporating supernatural enhancements that made them formidable opponents, despite their aquatic nature. Some possessed humanoid limbs that enabled terrestrial locomotion. Others bore teeth arranged in patterns that could shred metal, and still others displayed electrical or toxic capabilities that extended their threat range far beyond simple physical attacks. The weakness that all these summoned creatures shared lay in their dependence on the vases from which they had emerged, as destruction of the appropriate portal would instantly eliminate the corresponding monster, regardless of its individual power or defensive capabilities. This vulnerability provided tactical opportunity for opponents who could identify the correct vessel among potentially dozens of similar containers, while avoiding the creature's attacks long enough to reach their source portals. Yoko's personal transportation through his vase network enabled him to appear anywhere within his area of influence, while avoiding the mobility limitations that his serpentine lower body might otherwise have imposed on his tactical options. The instantaneous travel between containers occurred without intermediate stage or vulnerability period, allowing him to maintain optimal positioning for both offensive and defensive purposes, while preventing enemies from predicting his location or movement patterns. The water manipulation capabilities that supplemented his vase-based techniques could create aquatic environments within terrestrial spaces, flooding chambers with liquid that followed supernatural physics, while providing medium for his marine creatures to operate at full effectiveness. The water that he controlled possessed enhanced density and viscosity that could trap opponents while conducting electrical attacks or toxic substances that made simple contact potentially fatal. The artistic sensibility that shaped all of Gyoko's techniques reflected his background as craftsman whose aesthetic judgment had been corrupted by demonic transformation into appreciation for beauty found in suffering and death. His creatures and attacks bore elements of visual design that revealed sophisticated understanding of form and color, while serving functions that were purely destructive, creating cognitive dissonance between apparent artistry and underlying malevolence. The The psychological warfare potential of environmental manipulation through blood demon arts extended far beyond their obvious tactical applications. As opponents who could not trust their spatial perceptions or environmental stability found their mental resilience gradually eroded through constant stress of navigating reality that refused to behave according to expected patterns. The simple act of walking through doorways became exercise in uncertainty when those passages might lead anywhere, while the concept of retreat lost meaning when escape routes could vanish without warning or transport fleeing victims directly into enemy hands. The training required to develop such sophisticated environmental control demanded years or decades of experimentation with spatial relationships that most minds could barely comprehend. As these demons learned to visualize and manipulate dimensional parameters that had no equivalent in normal human experience, the mathematical concepts underlying their abilities exceeded anything that contemporary education could provide, requiring intuitive understanding of geometric principles that operated according to supernatural rather than natural law. The cost of wielding such power remained largely hidden from observation, yet the isolation that characterized these demons' existences suggested that their abilities might exact psychological prices that were not immediately apparent to external observers. The complete control over environmental conditions that their powers provided might have eliminated the unpredictability and challenge that normal consciousness required for healthy development, creating forms of existential boredom that could only be relieved through increasingly elaborate applications of their reality-warping capabilities. And so these masters of space and dimension continued their eternal manipulations of reality's fabric, reshaping the world around them according to whims and tactical needs, while remaining forever separated from the simple human experience of existing within stable, predictable environment where walls stayed walls and floors remained floors through all the turning of the seasons and the passing of the years. Among the most insidious and psychologically devastating of all blood demon arts are those that bind and constrain through threads both visible and invisible, transforming the fundamental human need for connection into instruments of torment that pervert the very concept of family bonds, while demonstrating how love itself can become weapon when wielded by creatures who understand intimacy only as another form of control. These arts of bondage operate through mechanisms that seem deceptively simple yet prove devastatingly effective, as their practitioners weave webs of supernatural material that trap not only the body but the spirit within, constructs that promise belonging, while delivering only suffering. The master of such thread-based manipulation, whose name carries weight of tragedy that extends far beyond his individual crimes, was known as Rui, the spider demon who claimed the title of Lower Moon 5 while occupying territory deep within the forests of Mount Natagumo, where his false family played out dramas of affection and abuse beneath canopies that filtered moonlight into, patterns resembling the webs that had become both his signature and his prison. His blood demon art, designated simply as thread manipulation, represented perhaps the most literal interpretation possible of the desire to control others through bonds that could not be broken by conventional means. The threads that Rui created emerged from his fingertips like extensions of his own nervous system, their supernatural composition combining the flexibility of silk with durability that exceeded the strongest steel, while maintaining cutting edges sharp enough to slice through Nichiren blades as easily as they parted ordinary flesh and bone. These crimson strands possessed properties that defied every assumption about how tensile materials were supposed to function, stretching to accommodate sudden stress while snapping taut with force sufficient to sever limbs when their creator desired maximum destructive impact. The creation process for these supernatural threads remained partially mysterious even to Rui himself, as the transformation that had granted him demonic powers had also provided instinctive understanding of techniques whose underlying principles operated according to rules that transcended normal understanding of how matter and energy interacted within three-dimensional space. His threads seemed to emerge from reserves of material that existed partially outside his physical form, enabling him to produce virtually unlimited quantities without depleting his bodily substance or compromising his structural integrity. The blood enhancement technique that could transform his already formidable threads into weapons of even greater lethality involved channeling his demonic life force through the strands until they took on distinctive crimson coloration that indicated maximum tensile strength and cutting capability. This process required conscious effort and energy expenditure that made it unsuitable for casual application. Yet when circumstances demanded ultimate performance from his thread-based attacks, the resulting weapons could cut through virtually any material while maintaining their enhanced properties for extended periods. The strategic applications of thread manipulation in combat scenarios ranged from subtle positioning control that gradually limited opponents' movement options to devastating attacks that could dismember multiple enemies simultaneously through coordinated strikes from angles that made defense nearly impossible. Rui's mastery of three-dimensional thinking enabled him to visualize complex web patterns that utilized environmental features while accounting for his enemies' likely responses, creating trap configurations that became more dangerous the more vigorously victims struggled against them. The web techniques that represented Rui's most sophisticated thread applications transformed entire sections of forest into hunting grounds where every tree branch and rocky outcropping became anchor point for strands that formed geometric patterns of mathematical precision and lethal beauty. These constructions required hours or days to complete properly, yet once established, they provided comprehensive area control that made conventional evasion tactics completely ineffective, while channeling intruders along predetermined paths toward locations where concentrated attacks could eliminate them efficiently. The psychological dimension of Rui's thread manipulation extended far beyond its obvious combat applications, as he employed his abilities to create literal bonds between the demons who comprised his artificial family unit, installing threads within their bodies that enabled him to control their movements and actions while preventing any attempt at escape or rebellion. These internal threads served dual purposes as control mechanisms and punishment devices, tightening to cause excruciating pain whenever their bearers displayed insufficient enthusiasm for their assigned roles within his twisted domestic fantasy. The family structure that Rui had constructed through strategic application of fear and supernatural bondage represented perhaps the most disturbing perversion of natural relationships that any demon had achieved. As each member played their assigned role under constant threat of torture or death, while maintaining facades of affection and contentment that satisfied his desperate need for belonging. The mother, father, and sister figures who surrounded him had been stripped of individual identity and agency, transformed into actors performing scripts written by their captors' psychological needs. The irony that defined Rui's entire existence lay in his genuine desire for family connection, combined with complete inability to understand that authentic relationships required mutual choice and respect rather than coercion and control, as his demonic transformation had preserved his emotional needs while destroying his capacity for the empathy and compromise that made healthy bonds possible. His threads served as physical manifestation of his psychological approach to relationships, binding others to himself through force, while remaining fundamentally alone despite their enforced proximity. The techniques that Rui employed during his confrontation with Tanjiro and the demon slayers who invaded his territory, demonstrated the full range of his thread-based abilities, while revealing both their tremendous power and their ultimate limitations when faced with opponents whose determination exceeded his capacity to understand or counter. His initial attacks utilized environmental threading that transformed the forest itself into weapon, with strands stretched between trees at heights and angles calculated to decapitate unwary intruders or slice them into segments too small to regenerate effectively. The cutting power that his enhanced threads displayed during these encounters exceeded anything that conventional materials science could explain, as they parted Nicaran steel with no more resistance than ordinary iron, while maintaining their structural integrity, despite impacts that should have snapped or dulled any normal cutting implement. The precision with which these invisible barriers could be positioned enabled Rui to create killing zones where movement in any direction would result in contact with lethal edges that victims could neither see nor avoid once they had entered his carefully prepared trap areas. The speed at which Rui could deploy new thread configurations during active combat reflected years of practice, combined with supernatural reflexes that enabled him to respond to changing tactical situations faster than human opponents could adapt their strategies, creating dynamic web patterns that evolved in real time to counter whatever approaches his enemies attempted. His ability to manipulate multiple threads simultaneously while maintaining perfect awareness of their positions and tensions required mental coordination that exceeded normal cognitive capabilities. The defensive applications of his thread manipulation proved equally formidable, as he could create barriers and shields from rapidly deployed strand networks that deflected physical attacks while providing platforms for counter-assaults that utilized the stored kinetic energy from blocked strikes. These defensive webs possess sufficient structural integrity to halt charging opponents, while maintaining enough flexibility to absorb impact forces that might otherwise transfer through rigid barriers to damage the demon behind them. The binding techniques that Rui employed against particularly dangerous opponents involved surrounding them with thread networks that tightened incrementally while preventing escape through any conventional means, creating situations where struggling only accelerated the cutting process while remaining motionless, merely delayed inevitable death by dismemberment. These capture methods required minimal energy expenditure once properly established, while providing psychological pressure that could break enemy morale even before physical damage became fatal. The aesthetic component of Rui's web construction reflected artistic sensibility that found beauty in geometric precision and mathematical relationships, as his thread patterns often incorporated elements of visual design that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of proportion and symmetry. Despite their purely functional purposes, the webs he created possessed undeniable elegance that revealed remnants of human appreciation for beauty, corrupted by demonic nature, into forms that served destructive rather than creative ends. The emotional investment that Rui displayed in his thread-based techniques stemmed from their symbolic connection to the family bonds he craved, as each strand represented his attempt to create lasting connections that could not be severed by choice or circumstance, while providing him with the control that his psychological damage convinced him was necessary for preventing abandonment. His threads served as externalized manifestation of his internal need to hold others close, literalized through supernatural power that made his metaphorical desire for binding relationships into actual physical constraints. The weakness that ultimately enabled his defeat lay not in any technical limitation of his thread manipulation abilities, but in the psychological framework that shaped how he employed them, as his desperate need for family connection created blind spots that prevented him from recognizing genuine bonds when they appeared. while causing him to underestimate opponents who fought to protect authentic relationships. His inability to comprehend that love could exist without control made him vulnerable to attacks motivated by selfless devotion rather than survival instinct. The legacy that Rui's thread manipulation techniques represented within the broader context of blood demon arts demonstrated how individual psychological needs could shape supernatural abilities in ways that reflected both the demon's greatest strengths and deepest vulnerabilities, as powers that seemed formidable in isolation often contained seeds of their own destruction when they emerged from emotional damage that limited their strategic applications. His threads could bind any physical opponent, yet proved powerless against spiritual connections that transcended material constraints. The training regimen that had enabled Rui to achieve such mastery over his thread-based abilities remained largely invisible to outside observers. Yet the precision and complexity of his techniques suggested decades of methodical practice, combined with experimentation that had pushed his inherited powers far beyond their initial capabilities, while developing applications that even other lower moon demons might have found difficult to counter effectively. His dedication to perfecting his art reflected the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized his approach to family construction. The environmental modifications that Rui's long-term residence on Mount Natagumo had produced created ideal conditions for thread-based combat, while providing natural camouflage for web constructions that might otherwise have been visible to approaching enemies, as the forest itself had been subtly altered through years of supernatural influence to enhance the effectiveness of his chosen fighting style. The tree spacing, branch angles, and ground elevation had all been adjusted to provide optimal anchor points for his most devastating techniques. The psychological toll that wielding such control-focused abilities extracted from their practitioner became evident in Rui's increasingly desperate attempts to manufacture genuine emotional responses from his captive family members, as the power to force compliance could not satisfy his deeper need for authentic affection, while the threads that bound others to him served as constant reminders of his fundamental isolation. His greatest strength as combatant became his greatest weakness as individuals seeking connection. The interaction between Rui's thread manipulation and the breathing techniques employed by his demon slayer opponents revealed interesting properties about how supernatural abilities responded to focused human will combined with Probert technique, as certain sword forms proved capable of cutting through his enhanced threads, while others found their effectiveness reduced by the unusual properties that his blood demon art imparted to otherwise ordinary steel attacks. The compatibility between different power systems remained unpredictable and situation-dependent. The scientific principles that might have explained how Rui's threads achieved their impossible combination of flexibility and cutting power remained beyond contemporary understanding, yet their consistent behavior suggested underlying rules that governed their operation, even when those rules contradicted conventional physics and materials science. The supernatural did not mean arbitrary, as his abilities followed patterns that could be learned and potentially countered by opponents who understood their limitations and requirements. The philosophical implications of Rui's thread manipulation extended beyond individual tragedy toward broader questions about the nature of relationships and the ethical boundaries that distinguished love from possession, as his literal binding of others served as extreme example of psychological patterns that appeared in less obvious forms throughout human society. His demonic power amplified tendencies that existed within normal human nature, revealing their ultimate destinations when unchecked by empathy or moral constraint. And so the spider demon's threads continued to bind and cut until the moment when they encountered bonds stronger than steel or supernatural silk, connections forged not through force but through choice, not through control but through sacrifice, demonstrating that the deepest human needs could only be satisfied through relationships that honored the freedom and dignity of all participants, rather than reducing others to extensions of one's own desperate hunger for belonging that could never be satisfied through domination alone. The realm of consciousness itself becomes battlefield when demons possess the power to invade and manipulate the very fabric of dreams and sleep, transforming humanity's most vulnerable state into hunting ground, where predators can harvest souls without their victims ever realizing they have crossed the threshold from waking world into nightmare realm, where reality bends according to malevolent will rather than natural law. These psychological warfare specialists represent perhaps the most insidious category of blood demon arts practitioners, as their abilities operate through mechanisms that bypass every defensive instinct while attacking targets at their most psychologically defenseless moments. Among these manipulators of mental states, no name carries more weight of dread than Enmu, the demon who earned the designation Lower Moon 1 through mastery of sleep induction and dream manipulation that enabled him to transform entire train cars full of passengers into unconscious victims trapped within personalized hells, crafted from their own deepest desires and most carefully guarded fears. His blood demon art operated through principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundary between conscious and unconscious experience, while demonstrating how supernatural power could weaponize the very processes that normal humans required for psychological health and restoration. The sleep induction capability that formed the foundation of Enmu's power manifested through mechanisms so subtle that victims rarely recognized their descent into unconsciousness until they found themselves already trapped within dream states that felt more real than their waking memories, creating situations where the transition between reality and illusion became impossible to detect through ordinary sensory information. This gradual onset prevented the kind of sudden alarm response that might have enabled resistance, while ensuring that subjects entered their induced sleep states with minds already primed for whatever manipulations their captor chose to impose. The delivery system that Enmu employed for his sleep-inducing influence utilized modern transportation technology in ways that demonstrated how ancient supernatural powers could adapt to contemporary circumstances while maintaining their essential characteristics, as the Mugen train itself became vector for his blood demon art through integration with mechanical systems that distributed his influence throughout passenger compartments. The tickets that travelers purchased for their journeys carried traces of his power that activated once the train had departed from stations where escape might have remained possible. The subtlety with which this influence spread through enclosed spaces reflected sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics, as Enmu recognized that sudden mass unconsciousness would create alarm among unaffected individuals, while gradual onset that began with naturally tired passengers would seem like normal response to travel fatigue until too many people had succumbed for the remainder to mount effective resistance. His approach prioritized stealth over speed while ensuring comprehensive coverage of his target population. The precision with which Enmu could calibrate his sleep induction effects enabled him to maintain consciousness among selected individuals who could serve his purposes better as aware collaborators rather than unconscious victims, creating networks of human accomplices whose cooperation he secured through promises that appealed to their desperate needs, while their altered mental states made critical evaluation of his offers nearly impossible. These conscious servants provided him with additional capabilities while serving as witnesses whose testimony could validate the apparent reality of situations that existed primarily within induced dream states. The dream manipulation techniques that represented Enmu's most sophisticated abilities operated through direct interface with victims' subconscious minds, enabling him to access memories, fears, desires, and psychological vulnerabilities that their conscious awareness might have kept carefully hidden even from themselves. This invasive mental contact provided him with raw material for constructing personalized dream scenarios, whose content would prove irresistibly appealing to each individual, while serving his strategic objectives through mechanisms that remained invisible to those experiencing them. The customization process that enabled such targeted psychological manipulation required rapid analysis of each victim's personality, history, and emotional needs through supernatural perception that could read psychic impressions embedded within their unconscious minds, like books whose pages revealed every significant experience and relationship that had shaped their development. This instantaneous psychological profiling enabled Enmu to craft dream experiences that felt authentic because they incorporated accurate details about people and events that held genuine meaning for their subjects. The paradise scenarios that Enmu typically employed as initial dream content drew their power from their subjects' deepest longings and most cherished memories, creating experiences of perfect happiness that satisfied needs which reality had never adequately addressed, while providing emotional fulfillment so complete that conscious will found resistance nearly impossible. These utopian visions served dual purposes as psychological traps and intelligence-gathering operations, as victims' responses revealed additional information about their values and vulnerabilities that could guide subsequent manipulations. The addiction potential inherent in such perfectly tailored wish fulfillment created psychological dependency that made escape increasingly difficult, as subjects became unwilling to abandon dream experiences that provided satisfaction beyond anything their waking lives had ever offered, leading them to resist awakening, even when rational analysis suggested that their current experiences might not represent genuine reality. The emotional investment that developed in these artificial relationships and achievements made voluntary departure from the dream state psychologically equivalent to suicide. The realm construction techniques that enabled Enmu to create stable dream environments involved establishing spatial and temporal frameworks that could contain extended narrative experiences while maintaining internal consistency, sufficient to prevent subjects from detecting logical contradictions that might trigger awakening responses. These mental landscapes required constant maintenance through subconscious monitoring that adjusted details and resolved inconsistencies faster than conscious thought could identify them as problematic. The borders that defined these dream realms served multiple functions as containment mechanisms and defensive barriers, preventing subjects from wandering into psychological territories that might reveal the artificial nature of their experiences while protecting Enmu's consciousness from contamination by his victim's mental contents. These boundaries remained invisible to dreaming subjects, yet formed absolute barriers that could not be crossed without specific knowledge of their existence and location. The spiritual core access technique that represented perhaps Enmu's most dangerous capability enabled him to reach beyond surface consciousness into the fundamental essence of his victim's identity and self-awareness, locating the metaphysical anchor point that connected their souls to their physical bodies while maintaining their sense of individual existence. This core represented the most vulnerable aspect of human consciousness because its destruction would leave bodies alive, but minds completely empty of personality, memory, and will. The process of locating each individual's spiritual core required navigation through psychological landscapes that reflected their subconscious architecture, following pathways of association and memory that led deeper into mental territories where normal logical rules gave way to symbolic representation and emotional logic that operated according to principles unique to each person's psychological development. These journeys into the deepest levels of consciousness exposed Enmu to aspects of human experience that his demonic nature found both fascinating and repulsive. The destruction techniques that could eliminate spiritual cause involved attacks that targeted the metaphysical structures, maintaining individual identity rather than physical brain tissue, creating damage that conventional medicine could neither detect nor repair, while leaving victims as empty vessels whose bodies continued functioning despite complete absence of conscious inhabitant. This ultimate form of murder transcended simple physical death to encompass spiritual annihilation that erased every trace of the person who had once occupied the surviving flesh. The nightmare scenarios that Enmu could impose as alternatives to paradise visions drew their psychological impact from intimate knowledge of each victim's deepest fears and most traumatic experiences, creating horror experiences so perfectly tailored to individual vulnerabilities that they could break mental resistance more effectively than any generic frightening imagery, while serving as punishment for subjects who displayed insufficient cooperation with his dream manipulations. These personalized terrors proved more devastating than universal fears because they incorporated specific details that resonated with particular psychological wounds. The torture applications of such targeted nightmare construction enabled prolonged punishment that could be calibrated to cause maximum psychological damage without triggering protective unconsciousness or dissociation responses that might enable victims to escape through mental withdrawal from their experiences. The precision with which these torments could be applied made them more effective than physical pain, while leaving no visible evidence that might alert outside observers to the suffering being inflicted. The interrogation possibilities that dream manipulation provided enabled extraction of information that subjects might never reveal under normal circumstances, as their unconscious minds contain knowledge that conscious discretion would normally protect, while dream logic made resistance to questioning feel unnecessary or impossible. The intelligence gathered through such methods could guide tactical decisions while providing detailed understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions that conventional espionage could never achieve. The time dilation effects that Enmu could create within dream states enabled subjective experiences that seemed to last hours or days while occupying only minutes of real time, maximizing the psychological impact of his manipulations, while preventing external interruption that might compromise his control over unconscious subjects. These temporal distortions made brief train journeys feel like extended stays in alternate realities where normal rules of causation and consequence did not apply. The memory alteration techniques that supplemented Enmu's basic dream manipulation enabled him to modify or erase recollections of real events, while implanting false memories that supported whatever narrative he wished his victims to believe about their circumstances and relationships. These changes to personal history could be made gradually to avoid triggering suspicion, while creating new psychological foundations that would support long-term behavioral modifications, serving his strategic objectives. The collective dreaming experiments that Enmu occasionally attempted involved connecting multiple subjects within shared dream spaces where their individual unconscious minds could interact according to rules that he established and monitored, creating group experiences that felt authentic while remaining under his complete control. These shared illusions enabled social manipulation on unprecedented scale, while providing entertainment value that satisfied his curiosity about human psychological responses to impossible situations. The awakening resistance protocols that protected Enmu's dream constructions from premature termination involved multiple layers of psychological barriers that made escape increasingly difficult as subjects penetrated deeper into his artificial realities, with early dream levels serving as buffers that absorbed awakening attempts, while deeper layers required increasingly sophisticated understanding of dream mechanics to navigate successfully. These defensive systems operated automatically once established, requiring minimal conscious maintenance, while providing comprehensive protection against most escape attempts. The human accomplice recruitment strategies that Enmu employed took advantage of the liminal state between sleep and wakefulness, where subjects remained technically conscious, yet possessed reduced critical thinking capacity that made them vulnerable to suggestion and persuasion techniques that would prove ineffective under normal circumstances. These partially awakened individuals could serve as extensions of his will within the physical world while remaining unaware of their compromised mental state. The tactical applications of dream manipulation in combat scenarios enabled Enmu to neutralize large numbers of opponents simultaneously, while gathering intelligence about their capabilities and plans through subconscious access that bypassed conscious mental defenses, creating overwhelming strategic advantages that conventional fighting techniques could never achieve against numerically superior forces. The psychological warfare potential of such abilities extended far beyond immediate tactical situations toward long-term demoralization of enemy organizations. The philosophical implications of Enmu's power to rewrite consciousness itself challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of identity and free will, while demonstrating how completely external manipulation could override individual autonomy when applied through mechanisms that bypassed conscious awareness and voluntary choice. His abilities represented ultimate violation of human dignity through techniques that reduced persons to passive recipients of imposed experiences that served only their manipulators' purposes. And so the master of dreams and nightmares continued his harvest of sleeping minds until the moment when he encountered consciousness strong enough to recognize illusion for what it was, will sufficient to choose painful truth over pleasant fiction, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated mental manipulation could not overcome spirit dedicated to protecting others regardless of personal cost, as authentic human bonds proved stronger than any artificial paradise that demonic power could construct from stolen memories and manufactured desires. The elemental forces of fire and ice represent primal powers that have shaped human civilization since the first spark was struck from flint and the first winter claimed lives through its merciless cold. Yet, within the realm of blood demon arts, these fundamental forces become instruments of supernatural will that transcend their natural limitations while embodying the deepest contradictions of demonic nature itself. These practitioners of thermal manipulation wield abilities that can both create and destroy, heal and harm, protect and consume, demonstrating how elemental mastery becomes reflection of the wielder's essential character when filtered through supernatural transformation that amplifies both noble and destructive impulses. Among these masters of temperature extremes, perhaps none embodies such profound contradiction as Nezuko Kamado, whose blood demon art represents unprecedented anomaly within the established understanding of how demonic powers typically manifest and operate. Her pyrokinesis, that supernatural control over flame and heat, defies every assumption about demon nature through its selective application that burns away evil while leaving innocent flesh completely unharmed, creating fire that serves as purifying force rather than indiscriminate destruction that characterizes most supernatural abilities. The flames that Nezuko creates emerge from her own blood through mechanisms that remain mysterious even to those who study demon physiology most intensively, as her fires possess properties that seem to violate fundamental principles of combustion while operating according to moral rather than physical laws. These pink-tinted flames carry temperatures that can reduce demon flesh to ash within moments, yet feel merely warm to human touch, creating thermal effects that distinguish between targets based on their spiritual rather than material nature. The selective burning capability that defines Nezuko's pyrokinetic abilities represents perhaps the most remarkable deviation from normal demon behavior patterns ever documented, as her flames seem to recognize and respond to the essential moral character of whatever they contact, rather than simply consuming all organic matter according to normal chemical processes. This discrimination between good and evil suggests that her blood demon art operates through spiritual mechanisms that transcend purely physical interaction while maintaining devastating effectiveness against supernatural threats. The protective applications of her flame manipulation became most dramatically evident during her confrontation with the spider demon Rui, when her fire proved capable of burning away his supposedly indestructible threads while leaving Tanjiro completely unharmed, despite his proximity to the conflagration that consumed their enemies' weapons. This selective combustion demonstrated tactical capabilities that exceeded simple offensive power to encompass precise area denial that could eliminate specific threats while preserving everything worthy of protection. The regeneration interference that Nezuko's flames could impose upon demon targets represented tactical breakthrough of enormous significance, as her fires could prevent the rapid healing that typically enabled supernatural creatures to recover from wounds that would prove fatal to normal opponents. The spiritual properties of her pyrokinesis seemed to burn away the very essence that enabled demonic regeneration, creating permanent damage that could not be repaired through normal supernatural healing processes. The poison neutralization capabilities that her flames displayed during the confrontation with Upper Moon 6 revealed additional applications that extended her protective potential beyond simple combat scenarios toward medical intervention that could save lives through supernatural healing that operated according to principles completely opposite to normal demon behavior. Her ability to burn away Gyutaro's deadly toxins from the bodies of poisoned demon slayers demonstrated how her powers could serve therapeutic rather than destructive purposes. The sword enhancement technique that enabled Nezuko to imbue Tanjiro's blade with her purifying flames created weapons capabilities that exceeded anything normal Nichiren steel could achieve against certain categories of supernatural opponents, as her fire-enhanced attacks could cut through defenses while preventing regeneration that might otherwise enable enemies to recover from wounds that appeared initially devastating. This collaborative application of her abilities multiplied the combat effectiveness of human partners while maintaining her selective harm principles. The emotional resonance that seemed to guide Nezuko's flame manifestation suggested deep connection between her psychological state and the specific properties that her fires displayed in different situations, as her protective instincts appeared to shape both the intensity and the targeting characteristics of her pyrokinetic abilities, while her retained humanity influenced how those powers expressed themselves through actual application. Her love for her brother and dedication to protecting innocent people seemed to flow directly into the spiritual mechanisms that distinguished her flames from normal combustion. The energy expenditure that Nezuko's pyrokinesis required appeared minimal compared to other blood demon arts of similar power levels, suggesting that her abilities drew their strength from sources that differed qualitatively from the mechanisms that powered most supernatural techniques, while operating with efficiency that reflected their alignment with positive rather than destructive purposes. The apparent ease with which she could maintain her flames for extended periods indicated sustainable power generation that did not deplete her physical resources. The aesthetic qualities that characterized Nezuko's fire displays created visual experiences of undeniable beauty that seemed inappropriate for weapons of such devastating effectiveness against demonic targets. As her pink flames danced and flickered with movements that suggested natural flame behavior, while producing colors and patterns that exceeded anything normal combustion could generate. This beauty served practical purposes by reassuring human allies, while potentially creating psychological advantages through the unexpected elegance of her attack presentations. In stark contrast to Nezuko's healing flames stood the crystalline artistry of Duma, the Upper Moon 2 demon whose cryokinetic abilities represented mastery over ice and cold that transformed winter's deadly beauty into weapons of surgical precision and overwhelming area effect devastation. His blood demon art operated through principles that seemed to freeze not merely water vapor and organic tissue, but the very life force that animated his victims, creating cold so profound that it could stop biological processes at cellular levels while preserving the aesthetic appeal that characterized all his supernatural techniques. The ice generation capability that formed the foundation of Duma's cryokinetic mastery enabled him to create frozen constructs from moisture drawn directly from atmospheric humidity, as well as from his own demonic blood, producing materials that possess structural integrity, exceeding normal ice while maintaining temperatures low enough to cause instant frostbite through mere proximity contact. These crystalline weapons and defensive barriers combined beauty with lethality in ways that reflected his appreciation for aesthetic perfection, even within combat scenarios. The atmospheric manipulation techniques that Duma employed to maximize his cryokinetic effectiveness involved creating localized climate conditions that favored ice formation while hampering his opponent's mobility and respiratory function through temperature gradients that could drop dozens of degrees within seconds of his blood demon art activation. These environmental modifications transformed entire battlefields into Arctic conditions where normal human physiology could not function effectively, while providing optimal conditions for his ice-based attacks. The lung freezing capability that represented perhaps Duma's most insidious technique operated through airborne ice crystals so fine that they remained invisible to normal observation, while penetrating deep into respiratory systems, where they caused cellular death through flash freezing that made normal breathing impossible. This attack method enabled him to disable multiple opponents simultaneously, while creating suffering that extended over prolonged periods as victims slowly suffocated despite their desperate attempts to draw breath from air that had become poison to their frozen lungs. The clone generation technique that Duma designated as Crystalline Divine Child demonstrated advanced applications of his cryokinetic abilities that transcended simple ice weapon creation toward construction of autonomous fighting units that possessed independent tactical capability, while remaining under his direct control through supernatural connection that enabled real-time coordination between multiple combat assets. These ice replicas maintained sufficient durability to engage opponents directly, while providing strategic advantages through numerical superiority. The structural properties that Duma's ice constructs displayed exceeded normal frozen water characteristics through supernatural enhancement that made his crystalline weapons as hard as steel while maintaining the sharp cutting edges that made ice particularly effective for slashing attacks, creating materials that combined optimal qualities of multiple weapon types while retaining the aesthetic beauty that satisfied his artistic sensibilities. These enhanced materials could withstand impacts that would shatter normal ice while maintaining their killing effectiveness throughout extended combat engagements. The defensive applications of Duma's cryokinetic mastery enabled him to create barriers and armor from rapidly formed ice that could absorb tremendous impact forces while distributing stress loads through crystalline matrices that redirected kinetic energy away from vital areas of his body, providing protection that complemented his natural demonic durability while creating opportunities for counterattacks that utilized his opponent's own momentum against them through strategic positioning of reflective ice surfaces. The aesthetic philosophy that guided all of Doma's ice techniques reflected his fundamental character as someone who found genuine pleasure in beauty, even when that beauty served purely destructive purposes, creating weapons and attacks that possessed undeniable artistic merit, while delivering death through mechanisms that preserved the visual appeal of both weapon and victim, even in their final moments. His ice sculptures retained the graceful forms of those they killed while serving as monuments to his technical skill and creative vision. The temperature control precision that enabled Daima to create ice effects of varying intensity and duration allowed him to calibrate his attacks according to tactical requirements that ranged from immediate lethal force to prolonged torture that could extract information or provide entertainment through carefully modulated application of freezing temperatures. This versatility made him a formidable opponent, whose responses could not be predicted based on previous encounter patterns, while maximizing the psychological impact of his capabilities. The preservation techniques that Duma's ice mastery enabled served both practical and philosophical purposes, as his ability to maintain frozen specimens of particularly interesting victims satisfied his collector instincts while providing trophies that demonstrated his artistic achievements to visitors who might appreciate the technical skill required to create such perfect representations of human beauty, captured at the moment of death. These preserved forms remained indefinitely stable through supernatural ice that never melted or degraded. The tactical coordination between offensive and defensive ice applications enabled Duma to create combat scenarios where his opponents faced constantly changing environmental conditions that favored his abilities while hampering their movement and attack options. As battlefield temperatures shifted according to his strategic needs, while ice barriers appeared and dissolved according to timing that maximized his advantages, while preventing enemies from establishing stable tactical positions or predictable approach vectors. The energy efficiency that characterized Duma's cryokinetic techniques reflected his mastery over thermal manipulation that enabled him to extract heat energy from his environment rather than generating cold through internal power expenditure, creating sustainable combat capabilities that could be maintained throughout extended engagements. While his opponent's physical capabilities gradually degraded through exposure to Arctic conditions that their bodies were not equipped to handle effectively, the psychological warfare applications of Duma's ice abilities extended beyond their obvious physical effects toward creation of mental states that combined hypothermic confusion with aesthetic appreciation that could distract victims from immediate survival needs while they became mesmerized by the beautiful death that approached them through crystalline constructs whose elegance seemed to promise peaceful rather than violent endings to their existence. The preservation of consciousness within frozen victims enabled Duma to maintain awareness in subjects whose bodies had been rendered immobile through ice formation, creating opportunities for extended interaction with opponents who remained mentally alert while physically helpless, providing entertainment value that satisfied his curiosity about human psychology under extreme stress while demonstrating his complete control over their fate through temperature manipulation that could be reversed or intensified according to his whims. The scientific principles underlying both pyrokinetic and cryokinetic blood demon arts suggested fundamental connections between thermal manipulation and spiritual energy that transcended normal thermodynamic relationships while operating according to supernatural laws that treated heat and cold as expressions of moral rather than merely physical forces, creating possibilities for temperature control that reflected the wielder's essential nature through mechanisms that remained beyond conventional scientific understanding. The philosophical implications of elemental mastery through blood demon arts raised profound questions about the relationship between power and purpose, while demonstrating how identical capabilities could serve completely opposite ends, depending on the moral character of those who wielded them, as fire could heal or destroy while ice could preserve or kill, according to the intentions and values that shaped their supernatural application through mechanisms that responded to spiritual rather than purely physical commands. And so these masters of thermal extremes continued their eternal dance between creation and destruction, healing and harm, demonstrating that elemental power became reflection of the soul that wielded it, while proving that even the most fundamental forces of nature could be transformed into expressions of either compassion or cruelty when filtered through consciousness that had transcended normal human limitations, through supernatural transformation that amplified both noble and destructive potential according to choices made in moments when power revealed character rather than created it. The marriage of lightning and supernatural power creates phenomena that transcend the natural world's most violent electrical displays, transforming the very essence of storm and thunder into weapons that channel both the destructive fury of nature and the corrupted potential of human ambition twisted through demonic transformation. Within the realm of blood demon arts, electrokinetic abilities represent perhaps the most visually spectacular and psychologically intimidating powers, as their practitioners wield forces that seem to tear reality itself through cascades of energy that illuminate darkness while delivering death at the speed of thought itself. The sole master of such electrical manipulation, whose story carries weight of betrayal and corruption, stands as testament to how noble training can be perverted through supernatural influence. As Kaigaku's transformation from dedicated demon slayer to Upper Moon 6 demon created being whose abilities combined the disciplined techniques of thunder breathing with the raw power of demonic enhancement, his blood demon art, manifesting as control over black lightning that crackled with malevolent energy, represented perversion of everything pure about the electrical phenomena that normally illuminated storms and brought life-giving rain to parched earth. The black coloration that distinguished Kaigaku's supernatural lightning from natural electrical discharges served as visual indicator of corruption that had transformed benevolent natural force into instrument of malice and destruction, as his demonic blood had altered fundamental properties of electrical energy to create manifestations that absorbed rather than reflected light, while generating electromagnetic fields that disrupted normal biological processes in ways that natural lightning could never achieve. These dark bolts carried not merely physical energy, but spiritual contamination that could corrupt whatever they touched with essence of his transformed nature. The generation process for Kaigaku's electrokinetic abilities drew power from internal sources that combined his demonic blood with residual knowledge from years of thunder-breathing training, creating a hybrid system that could produce electrical effects far exceeding anything normal human practitioners could achieve, while maintaining tactical applications that reflected deep understanding of how lightning-based techniques could be optimized for combat effectiveness. His transformation had not erased his technical knowledge, but rather corrupted it into service of supernatural power that operated according to different moral principles. The integration between his inherited thunder-breathing forms and newly acquired blood demon art capabilities created combat style that represented evolution of traditional demon slayer techniques beyond their intended limitations, as each sword strike carried electrical enhancement that multiplied cutting power, while creating secondary effects that could disable opponents through nervous system disruption. Even when primary attacks failed to achieve decisive damage, this fusion of human skill with demonic power created tactical advantages that pure blood demon art or unenhanced breathing techniques could never match individually. The speed enhancement that Kaigaku's electrokinetic abilities provided exceeded normal thunder-breathing acceleration through supernatural boost that enabled movement approaching true lightning velocity, creating combat scenarios where his attacks arrived faster than opponents could perceive, while generating electrical trails that marked his passage through space with crackling energy that persisted long enough to create additional hazards for anyone following his movement patterns. This velocity made conventional evasion tactics nearly impossible while preventing coordinated counterattacks that required predictable positioning. The nervous system disruption effects that his black lightning could inflict upon living targets operated through mechanisms that combined electrical shock with demonic corruption, creating paralysis that went beyond simple muscle seizure toward temporary disconnection between consciousness and physical control that left victims aware but helpless while their bodies refused to respond to mental commands. These effects proved particularly devastating against opponents whose fighting effectiveness depended on precise timing and coordination between thought and action. The flesh-rending capability that accompanied Kaigaku's electrical attacks resulted from energy levels that exceeded what normal biological tissue could withstand, as his lightning carried sufficient power to literally cook exposed flesh while creating wounds that burned from within through electrical pathways that followed nervous system channels deeper into victims' bodies than external injuries could normally penetrate. The combination of cutting, burning, and electrical damage created trauma that overwhelmed normal healing responses while causing pain that persisted long after initial contact had ended. The crackling sound effects that accompanied all of Kaigaku's electrical techniques served both intimidation and tactical functions, as the supernatural thunder that his attacks generated could disorient opponents while masking approach sounds that might otherwise have provided warning of incoming strikes. The psychological impact of constant electrical noise created an atmosphere of tension and fear that could undermine enemy morale while advertising his presence in ways that enhanced his reputation among demons who respected displays of raw power. The range extension capabilities that his blood demon art provided enabled Kaigaku to project electrical attacks across distances that normal sword techniques could never achieve, transforming close-quarters thunder-breathing forms into medium-range weapons that could strike targets while maintaining safe separation from opponents whose capabilities might prove dangerous in direct contact scenarios. This increased effective engagement range multiplied his tactical options while reducing vulnerability to counterattacks that required proximity to succeed. The environmental interaction effects that Kaigaku's black lightning created when discharged in enclosed spaces included electromagnetic pulses that could interfere with normal electrical phenomena, while generating ozone concentrations that made breathing difficult for opponents whose respiratory systems were not adapted to handle such atmospheric contamination. These secondary effects transformed entire battlefields into hazardous environments that favored his enhanced demonic physiology while hampering normal human function. The chain lightning techniques that represented advanced applications of his electrokinetic mastery enabled single attacks to jump between multiple targets through electrical pathways that sought optimal conductivity routes regardless of distance or intervening obstacles, creating area effect weapons that could disable entire groups of opponents while requiring energy expenditure comparable to single target techniques. These branching electrical attacks proved particularly effective against coordinated enemy teams whose mutual proximity created ideal conditions for electrical transmission. The electrical absorption capabilities that his demonic transformation had granted enabled Kaigaku to draw power from external electrical sources, including natural lightning strikes and artificial electrical systems, making him more dangerous during storms while providing renewable energy source that could sustain extended combat operations without depleting his internal reserves. This environmental energy harvesting created tactical advantages that increased over time, rather than diminishing through battle fatigue. The weapon enhancement applications of his Blood Demon art enabled him to channel electrical energy through metal objects, including his sword, and any improvised weapons he might acquire during combat, transforming ordinary tools into conduits for his supernatural power, while extending his effective reach through any electrically conductive materials within his operational environment. This versatility made him dangerous even when separated from his primary weapons, while enabling creative tactical applications that opponents could not easily predict. The defensive applications of Kaigaku's electrical abilities included creation of electromagnetic barriers that could deflect metal projectiles, while disrupting electronic devices that enemies might employ for communication or tactical coordination, providing protection against certain categories of attacks, while creating information warfare capabilities that could isolate opponents from support networks. These defensive techniques operated continuously once activated, requiring minimal conscious attention while maintaining effectiveness against a wide range of potential threats. The torture applications of controlled electrical discharge enabled Kaigaku to inflict precise amounts of pain without causing permanent physical damage, creating interrogation tools that could extract information through suffering that left no visible evidence while demonstrating his complete control over victims' nervous system responses. The psychological impact of such precise pain application often proved more effective than crude physical violence, while satisfying his sadistic impulses through technical displays of electrical mastery. The execution techniques that represented lethal applications of his electrokinetic abilities could kill through multiple mechanisms, including cardiac arrest, nervous system shutdown, or simply cooking internal organs through electrical energy that generated heat faster than biological cooling systems could dissipate, providing variety of death options that could be selected according to tactical requirements or personal preference for how victims should die. These killing methods reflected both efficiency and cruelty that characterized his approach to problem solving. The training regimen that had originally developed Kaigaku's thunder-breathing skills provided foundation for electrical manipulation that his demonic transformation had corrupted rather than replaced, as his understanding of how electrical energy moved through human bodies and interacted with nervous system function had been perverted into knowledge of how to weaponize such interactions for maximum destructive effect. His original dedication to mastering lightning-based techniques had become obsession with perfecting electrical torture and execution methods. The psychological profile that emerged from Kaigaku's use of his electrokinetic abilities revealed character shaped by resentment and jealousy that had made him vulnerable to demonic corruption, as his original inability to master the first form of thunder-breathing had created inferiority complex. That demonic power seemed to resolve through granting capabilities that exceeded what pure human training could achieve. His electrical mastery became compensation for perceived inadequacy, rather than expression of noble purpose. The tactical limitations that constrained Kaigaku's electrical abilities included vulnerability to electrical grounding techniques that could dissipate his attacks, while reducing their effectiveness against opponents who understood how to use environmental features to redirect or absorb electrical energy that might otherwise prove devastating. His reliance on electrical effects also created predictable attack patterns that experienced opponents could learn to counter through proper preparation and positioning. The comparison between Kaigaku's corrupted electrical abilities and the pure thunder-breathing techniques employed by his former fellow student Zenitsu revealed how identical training could produce completely opposite results, depending on the moral character and motivational framework that shaped how inherited knowledge was applied through actual practice. Where Zenitsu's lightning served protective purposes, Kaigaku's electricity existed purely for destruction and self-aggrandizement. The irony that defined Kaigaku's entire existence lay in his achievement of electrical mastery that exceeded his original dreams through methods that corrupted everything noble about the training he had received, as his demonic transformation had granted him power to surpass his former limitations while simultaneously destroying his capacity to find satisfaction in accomplishment that served no purpose beyond personal gratification. His greatest triumph became his ultimate tragedy through loss of moral foundation that could have given meaning to his enhanced abilities. The legacy that Kaigaku's electrokinetic blood demon art represented within the broader context of demon abilities demonstrated how individual character flaws could shape supernatural power in ways that reflected and amplified existing psychological damage while providing capabilities that enabled expression of destructive impulses that normal human limitations might have contained. His electrical mastery became externalization of internal corruption that had preceded and enabled his demonic transformation. And so the master of Black Lightning continued his dance of electrical destruction until the moment when he encountered lightning pure and bright, wielded by hands that served others rather than self, demonstrating that power itself remained neutral, while the spirit that guided its application determined whether electrical energy would illuminate darkness or deepen it through corruption that transformed natural wonder into supernatural nightmare, serving only pride and malice that could never be satisfied regardless of how much destruction they might achieve. The art of weaving destruction through materials both precious and deadly finds its most elegant expression in those blood demon arts that transform fabric and liquid into weapons of impossible grace, creating combat styles that blend aesthetic beauty with lethal efficiency while demonstrating how vanity and violence can merge into forms of supernatural artistry that disguise their murderous intent behind veils of silk and streams of bay, crimson that dance through air, with movements too fluid and beautiful to seem threatening, until their razor edges part flesh, with cuts so clean that death arrives before pain can register in minds that mistake elegance for harmlessness. Among these practitioners of textile violence, few names carry such weight of tragic beauty as the siblings who shared the designation Upper Moon 6, while embodying opposite aspects of the same fundamental corruption that transformed love into control and protection into possession. Daki, whose name spoke of beauty that concealed venom, wielded her blood demon art through manipulation of obi sashes that emerged from her own flesh with properties that defied every assumption about how fabric should behave when subjected to supernatural enhancement, while her brother Gyutaro complemented her silk-based techniques with mastery over blood manipulation that created weapons from his own life essence, while demonstrating how sibling bonds could become instruments of shared destruction. The obi creation process that formed the foundation of Daki's combat capabilities operated through mechanisms that transformed her demonic flesh into textile materials whose properties exceeded anything normal weaving could produce, as the sashes she generated possessed tensile strength approaching that of Nichiren steel, while maintaining flexibility that enabled them to move through three-dimensional space with fluid grace that seemed to mock the limitations that normally constrained solid materials. These supernatural fabrics emerged from her back through processes that appeared effortless yet required precise control over biological systems that had been fundamentally altered through her transformation from human courtesan into predatory demon. The flower patterns that decorated Daki's obi sashes served both aesthetic and functional purposes, as their intricate designs created visual beauty that satisfied her vanity, while incorporating structural elements that enhanced the fabric's cutting effectiveness through microscopic serrations that lined the decorative motifs. These seemingly ornamental details transformed her sashes into weapons whose lethality was hidden behind appearances of artistic craftsmanship, creating cognitive dissonance in opponents who struggled to reconcile the obvious beauty of her attacks with their devastating physical effects. The retraction mechanism that enabled Daki to withdraw her obi sashes back into her body provided tactical advantages that extended beyond simple weapon recovery toward creation of dynamic attack patterns that could change direction and intensity without warning, as sashes that appeared to be completing their strike patterns could suddenly reverse course to attack from unexpected angles, while maintaining their cutting power throughout these rapid directional changes. This capability made her assault patterns nearly impossible to predict, while enabling complex tactical maneuvers that utilized three-dimensional space more effectively than conventional weapons could achieve. The distance control that Daki exercised over her detached obi sashes demonstrated supernatural connection between her consciousness and the textile extensions of her will that transcended normal limitations of direct physical contact, enabling her to coordinate attacks from ranges that placed her beyond immediate retaliation while maintaining precise control over weapon positioning and timing. This remote manipulation capability transformed entire battlefields into zones where her influence could manifest without warning, while her physical form remained safely positioned outside her opponent's effective engagement. Range. The cutting effectiveness that her supernatural silk displayed exceeded anything normal fabric could achieve through sharpness that approached molecular levels, while maintaining durability that prevented the blade edges from dulling or breaking despite repeated contact with hard materials, including enhanced Demon Slayer swords. The mechanism that enabled textile materials to achieve such impossible cutting performance remained mysterious even to Daki herself, yet the results were undeniably effective against opponents whose defensive capabilities had been designed to counter conventional metal weapons rather than weaponized fabric. The defensive applications of Daki's obi manipulation enabled her to create shields and barriers from rapidly woven textile configurations that could absorb tremendous impact forces while distributing kinetic energy across surface, areas large enough to prevent localized damage that might compromise the protective barrier's structural integrity. These defensive weaves could form and dissolve according to tactical requirements, while maintaining effectiveness against a wide range of attack types, including projectiles, explosive forces, and directed energy weapons that might prove devastating against more rigid defensive systems. The binding techniques that represented some of Daki's most tactically valuable capabilities enabled her to restrain opponents through obi configurations that tightened automatically in response to struggling while preventing escape through any conventional means, creating capture methods that required minimal energy expenditure once properly deployed, while providing opportunities for interrogation or execution according to strategic needs. These binding patterns incorporated slipknot principles that made resistance counterproductive, while ensuring that captured subjects remained immobilized, regardless of their individual strength or desperation. The storage capability that Daki's obi sashes possessed enabled her to preserve captured humans within dimensional pockets that existed somehow within the fabric itself, compressing three-dimensional beings into two-dimensional forms that could be maintained indefinitely without apparent degradation, while providing portable food supply that could be accessed whenever her appetite demanded satisfaction. This preservation technique operated through supernatural mechanisms that suspended normal biological processes while maintaining tissue viability for consumption purposes. The transformation process that reduced living beings to flat representations within her obi storage demonstrated advanced applications of her blood demon art that transcended simple textile manipulation toward reality warping, capabilities that could alter fundamental properties of matter and space through mechanisms that challenged basic assumptions about how dimensional relationships were supposed to function according to natural law. These compression effects proved reversible when she desired to extract stored subjects for consumption or entertainment purposes. The aesthetic philosophy that guided all of Ducky's textile techniques reflected her fundamental character as someone whose vanity had been amplified through demonic transformation into obsession with beauty that viewed everything, including violence and death, as opportunities for artistic expression that demonstrated her superior taste and creative vision. Her obi attacks incorporated elements of choreographic grace that transformed combat into performance art, designed to showcase her elegance while destroying opponents who lacked appreciation for her sophisticated techniques. In stark contrast to his sister's elegant fabric manipulation stood Gyutaro, whose blood demon art operated through principles that embraced the crude reality of violence, while demonstrating how love corrupted by jealousy and resentment could become force for destruction that transcended individual hatred toward systematic elimination of everything beautiful that reminded him of opportunities and experiences that his own ugliness had placed forever beyond his reach. His sickle-shaped blood constructs represented externalization of internal bitterness that had been honed through decades of suffering into weapons of unprecedented lethality. The blood generation capability that enabled Gyutaro's techniques drew upon virtually unlimited reserves that his enhanced demonic physiology could produce through accelerated circulation systems that operated at rates far exceeding normal biological parameters, creating renewable resource for weapon construction that could sustain extended combat operations without depleting his essential life functions, while providing raw material for increasingly sophisticated weapon configurations. His regenerative abilities ensured that blood loss through weapon creation never compromised his survival capabilities, while enabling tactical approaches that treated his life essence as expendable ammunition. The solidification process that transformed liquid blood into weapons with metallic hardness and razor sharpness operated through supernatural chemistry that altered molecular structure of organic fluid into materials whose properties exceeded anything conventional metallurgy could produce through normal forging techniques. These blood-based weapons maintained their enhanced characteristics for extended periods, while retaining connection to their creator's consciousness that enabled remote control and tactical coordination, impossible with ordinary projectile weapons. The sickle configuration that Gyutaro favored for his blood weapons reflected both practical considerations about cutting effectiveness and personal aesthetic preferences that found satisfaction in tools whose curved blades could inflict maximum tissue damage through slashing motions that opened wounds too large for normal healing processes to address effectively. The crescent shape also provided superior aerodynamic properties that enhanced accuracy and range, while creating distinctive visual signature that advertised his presence to enemies who learned to fear the sight of crimson crescents cutting through darkness. The velocity control that Gyutaro exercised over his blood projectiles enabled him to vary their speed according to tactical requirements that ranged from slow-moving attacks designed to herd opponents into predetermined positions, hypersonic strikes that arrived faster than normal human reflexes could register or counter. This variable velocity capability made his attack patterns unpredictable, while enabling tactical combinations that utilize different speeds to create complex timing sequences that overwhelmed defensive responses. The trajectory manipulation that his blood weapon mastery provided enabled mid-flight course corrections that made evasion nearly impossible once his attacks had been launched, as the projectiles could adjust their paths according to target movement, while maintaining momentum and cutting power throughout their revised flight patterns. This homing capability transformed his ranged attacks into guided missiles that could pursue fleeing opponents while accounting for defensive maneuvers that might otherwise have enabled escape from conventional projectile weapons. The shield formation technique that Gyutaro could execute using his blood manipulation created protective barriers from rapidly constructed domes of solidified blood that could absorb tremendous impact forces while providing complete environmental protection against area effect attacks, including explosive devices and poison gas deployments. These defensive blood constructs maintained structural integrity through supernatural cohesion that prevented them from shattering under stress, while enabling rapid reconstruction if damage did occur during combat operations. The tactical coordination between Daki's Obi attacks and Gyutaro's blood weapons created combination techniques that multiplied their individual effectiveness through synchronized assault patterns that attacked from multiple angles simultaneously, while providing mutual support that covered each sibling's tactical weaknesses with complementary capabilities. Their shared consciousness enabled perfect timing coordination that made their combined attacks nearly impossible to counter through conventional defensive techniques. The poison enhancement that Gyutaro could apply to his blood weapons added biochemical warfare dimension to his attacks that made even minor wounds potentially fatal through toxins, whose effects could not be neutralized by normal medical intervention, while creating psychological pressure on opponents who understood that any contact with his weapons could result in slow, agonizing death, regardless of the severity of initial injuries. This poison capability transformed every successful attack into potential execution, while adding time pressure that forced enemies into increasingly desperate tactical decisions. The area denial applications of Gyutaro's blood manipulation enabled him to create hazardous zones filled with floating blood weapons that could attack any target that entered their operational parameters, while maintaining defensive coverage that made approach to his position extremely dangerous for opponents who lacked specialized techniques for dealing with multiple simultaneous threats. These defensive fields required minimal conscious control once established, while providing comprehensive protection against conventional assault tactics. The sibling synchronization that characterized the coordination between Daki and Gyutaro's combat techniques reflected emotional bonds that had been strengthened rather than weakened by their demonic transformation, as their shared experiences of suffering and mutual dependence had created psychological connection that enabled tactical cooperation, exceeding anything normal team training could achieve. Their ability to anticipate each other's actions and coordinate complex maneuvers reflected understanding that transcended normal communication requirements. The aesthetic contrast between Daki's elegant Obi techniques and Gyutaro's crude blood weapons reflected their different approaches to violence, while demonstrating how siblings could develop complementary capabilities that address different tactical requirements within shared operational framework. Where Daki's attacks emphasized grace and beauty, Gyutaro's techniques prioritized raw effectiveness and intimidation value that could break enemy morale through displays of overwhelming lethality. The emotional foundation that sustained both siblings' combat effectiveness drew strength from protective instincts that had been corrupted through demonic transformation into possessive violence that viewed threats to their bond as existential challenges requiring total elimination of anyone who might interfere with their relationship. Their love for each other had become a weapon that made them more dangerous together than either could have been individually, while creating vulnerability through emotional dependence that enemies might exploit. And so these practitioners of textile and hemoglobin artistry continued their dance of silk and blood until they encountered opponents whose bonds proved stronger than possession, whose protection transcended ownership, demonstrating that authentic love created strength that corrupted affection could never match, regardless of how deadly the weapons it forged from vanity and resentment that transformed beauty into horror while reducing everything precious into tools for inflicting pain upon world that had failed to appreciate gifts that pride and jealousy had turned into curses upon themselves and all who crossed their path. The fractured mind becomes battlefield when fear transforms from mere emotion into architectural principle for supernatural power, creating blood demon arts that literalize the psychological fragmentation that terror can inflict upon consciousness, while demonstrating how cowardice itself can become source of strength when properly channeled through demonic abilities that turn weakness into tactical advantage. Among these manifestations of divided consciousness, perhaps no example proves more disturbing than the techniques employed by those demons whose fundamental nature splits them into multiple entities that share common origin while possessing distinct personalities and capabilities that multiply their effectiveness through numerical superiority that emerges from psychological rather than physical reproduction. The ultimate expression of such emotionally driven multiplication manifests in the blood demon art wielded by Hantengu, whose designation as Upper Moon 4 reflected not merely his individual combat capabilities, but the collective power of the emotional avatars that his terror-driven psyche could generate through supernatural mechanisms that transformed abstract feelings into concrete fighting units. His ability, known as emotion manifestation, operated through principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the unity of consciousness, while demonstrating how intense psychological pressure could shatter identity into component parts that maintained independent existence. Through demonic power that treated personality as divisible resource rather than indivisible whole. The activation mechanism that triggered Hantengu's cloning ability operated through decapitation attempts that would prove instantly fatal to normal demons. Yet for him, such attacks served merely as catalysts for multiplication that transformed apparent defeat into tactical advantage through supernatural regeneration that created additional combatants rather than simply restoring damaged tissue. This counterintuitive response to mortal threats reflected psychological adaptation that had learned to transform destruction into creation, while turning every successful enemy attack into opportunity for numerical expansion that favored his strategic position. The division process that occurred whenever Hantengu's head separated from his body involved complex supernatural mechanisms that split both his physical form and his consciousness according to emotional categories that reflected different aspects of his fundamental personality structure, creating beings that embodied specific feelings while retaining sufficient independence to develop their own tactical approaches and combat preferences. These emotional avatars possessed complete autonomous function while remaining connected to their source through metaphysical bonds that enabled coordination and mutual support during combat operations. The four primary emotions that typically manifested as separate entities during Hantengu's defensive responses were Sekido representing anger, Karaku embodying pleasure, Aizetsu manifesting sorrow, and Urogi expressing joy, each bearing distinctive physical characteristics that reflected their emotional nature while possessing unique blood demon art capabilities that complemented their personality traits through supernatural abilities tailored to their Specific psychological profiles. The kanji characters tattooed upon their tongues served as identification markers that revealed their emotional essence while providing visual confirmation of which aspect of Hantengu's psyche they represented. Sakido, the avatar of rage and frustration, wielded electrokinetic abilities that manifested his emotional state through lightning-based attacks, whose fury matched the intensity of anger that defined his existence, creating weapons from pure electrical energy that could strike multiple targets simultaneously while generating electromagnetic effects that disrupted enemy coordination and communication systems. His staff weapon channeled these electrical powers while providing focus for area effect techniques that could disable entire groups of opponents through precisely controlled lightning strikes that reflected his methodical approach to expressing overwhelming wrath. The discipline that characterized Sakido's combat approach reflected anger that had been refined through experience into tactical weapon rather than simple emotional outburst, as his fury provided motivation for sustained combat effectiveness, while his intelligence enabled strategic application of electrical powers that maximized destruction while conserving energy for extended engagements. His leadership role among the emotional avatars stemmed from his ability to maintain focus despite overwhelming rage, while coordinating complex tactical operations that required precise timing and positioning. Karaku, the embodiment of pleasure and hedonistic satisfaction, expressed his emotional nature through wind-based blood demon art that created attacks combining playful creativity with devastating destructive potential, as his techniques transformed atmospheric manipulation into entertainment that satisfied his need for stimulation while eliminating opponents through methods that prioritized spectacle over efficiency. His folding fan served as focus for wind techniques that could generate hurricanes, tornadoes, and pressure waves capable of reducing buildings to rubble, while providing him with aerial mobility that enabled three-dimensional combat tactics. The sadistic creativity that drove Karaku's technique development reflected pleasure-seeking personality that found satisfaction in devising increasingly elaborate methods for inflicting suffering upon opponents who provided entertainment value through their struggles against impossible odds. Yet his attacks retained tactical effectiveness despite their theatrical presentation because his enjoyment of combat motivated continuous innovation that prevented enemies from adapting to predictable attack patterns. His aerial superiority created strategic advantages that complemented his siblings' ground-based capabilities while providing reconnaissance and fire support. Aizetsu, the manifestation of sorrow and melancholy, channeled his emotional essence through spear-based techniques that reflected the piercing nature of despair, while demonstrating how depression could become weapon when properly focused through supernatural enhancement that transformed emotional pain into physical attacks, capable of penetrating any defense. His Yari weapon possessed length and precision that enabled long-range combat, while its supernatural properties could bypass armor and defensive techniques through mechanisms that treated physical barriers as irrelevant obstacles to emotional truth. The reluctant efficiency that characterized Aizetsu's combat performance reflected genuine sadness about the necessity of violence, while maintaining absolute dedication to tactical objectives that required elimination of threats to his family unit, creating psychological conflict that enhanced rather than hindered his effectiveness, because his sorrow provided emotional depth that motivated careful technique execution aimed at minimizing suffering for all participants. His defensive capabilities protected his more aggressive siblings, while his precision attacks could eliminate specific threats with minimal collateral damage. Urogi, the avatar of joy and exuberant pleasure, expressed his emotional nature through sonic attacks that utilized his avian characteristics to generate sound-based weapons whose frequency ranges could shatter stone, rupture eardrums, or create psychological effects that incapacitated opponents through audio stimulation that overwhelmed normal human sensory processing capabilities. His flight abilities provided tactical mobility that complemented his ranged attack options, while enabling rapid position changes that made him difficult target for ground-based opponents. The infectious enthusiasm that Urogi brought to combat situations could destabilize enemy morale through psychological warfare that demonstrated genuine enjoyment of violence while creating cognitive dissonance in opponents who struggled to maintain serious tactical focus when facing adversary whose obvious pleasure in battle challenged their assumptions about appropriate emotional responses to life or death situations. His aerial attacks utilized gravity and momentum to multiply impact forces, while his sonic techniques could coordinate with his siblings' abilities to create combination attacks. The tactical coordination that the four emotional avatars could achieve through their shared consciousness exceeded anything normal team training could produce, as their common origin enabled perfect communication and strategic synchronization, while their distinct personalities provided diverse perspectives on problem-solving that enhanced their collective intelligence. Their ability to execute complex multi-vector attacks that utilized their different capabilities in precisely timed sequences created combat scenarios where opponents faced simultaneous threats that no single defensive strategy could address effectively. The numerical advantage that Hantengu's emotion manifestation provided extended beyond simple multiplication of fighting units toward creation of tactical complexity that overwhelmed enemy decision-making capabilities through presentation of too many simultaneous threats for normal human consciousness to process and prioritize effectively. Opponents found themselves forced to divide attention between multiple dangerous adversaries whose coordinated attacks created compound tactical problems that exceeded individual human ability to solve within time constraints that combat situations imposed. The regenerative properties that each emotional avatar possessed enabled them to recover from injuries that would prove fatal to normal demons, while maintaining their individual effectiveness throughout extended combat engagements. Yet their most significant defensive characteristic remained their connection to Hantengu's original body, whose survival ensured their continued existence, regardless of damage inflicted upon their manifestations. This invulnerability made conventional elimination tactics ineffective while forcing opponents to identify and target the true source of their multiplication. The psychological warfare potential of fighting multiple versions of the same opponent created mental pressure that could break enemy morale through demonstration of apparently infinite reinforcement capability, as each successful attack against one avatar only resulted in creation of additional enemies, whose fresh condition contrasted sharply with the accumulated fatigue and damage that normal fighters experience during prolonged combat. This psychological advantage often proved decisive, even when tactical situation might otherwise have favored human opponents. The evolution capability that enabled Hantengu's emotional avatars to merge into more powerful combinations represented advanced application of his blood demon art that could create entities whose capabilities exceeded the sum of but their component parts through supernatural fusion processes that combine different emotional essences into hybrid beings with enhanced abilities. These merged forms possessed greater individual power, while reducing numerical advantage in ways that reflected changing tactical requirements as combat situations developed. The hidden body protection strategy that Hantengu employed involved maintaining his original diminutive form in concealed locations while his emotional avatars engaged opponents directly, creating tactical scenarios where enemies achieved apparent victory through elimination of visible threats, while remaining vulnerable to attacks from concealed source, whose location and capabilities remained unknown until too late for effective countermeasures. This deception required precise timing and positioning to maintain effectiveness. The cowardice that defined Han Tengu's fundamental character provided tactical advantages through risk assessment that prioritized survival over glory, while enabling strategic withdrawal when situations developed beyond his ability to control. Yet this same fear created psychological vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through approaches that increased rather than reduced his anxiety levels. His terror of death motivated careful planning, yet also created paralysis when faced with genuinely superior opponents. The philosophical implications of Han Tengu's ability to manifest emotions as separate entities raised profound questions about the nature of consciousness and identity, while demonstrating how psychological fragmentation could become a source of power rather than weakness when properly channeled through supernatural abilities that treated mental division as tactical resource. His technique challenged assumptions about unity of self, while proving that coherent identity was not prerequisite for effective action. The irony that characterized Han Tengu's existence lay in his transformation of fear into strength through mechanisms that multiplied his presence while simultaneously highlighting his fundamental isolation, as his emotional avatars provided companionship that could never address his core loneliness, because they remained extensions of his own psyche rather than genuine relationships with independent beings capable of providing authentic connection and understanding that his fragmented consciousness desperately craved yet could never achieve through self-generated companions. And so the master of emotional multiplication continued his dance of division and multiplication until the moment when he encountered opponents whose unity transcended individual limitation, whose cooperation emerged from choice rather than psychological necessity, demonstrating that authentic strength came not from fragmenting oneself into component parts, but from integrating all aspects of personality into coherent whole, capable of growth and connection that mere multiplication of weakness could never achieve. Regardless of how many copies fear might create, to avoid confronting its own essential emptiness. The pinnacle of demonic evolution manifests when ancient wisdom merges with supernatural power to create beings whose mastery transcends the crude applications of raw strength, elevating blood demon arts beyond simple enhancement into realms of technical perfection that combines centuries of accumulated knowledge with abilities that redefine the very boundaries of what individual consciousness can achieve through disciplined application of will made manifest in techniques that blur the distinction between martial artistry and supernatural phenomenon. These ultimate practitioners represent the convergence of human potential with demonic capability, creating entities whose combat abilities operate at levels that challenge fundamental assumptions about the limits of individual power, while demonstrating how dedication and talent can be amplified through transformation that preserves the best aspects of human achievement, while adding dimensions of capability that mortality could never access. Among these paragons of perfected technique stands Akaza, whose designation as Upper Moon 3 reflected not merely his ranking within Muzan's hierarchy, but his achievement of martial excellence that transcended the boundary between human discipline and demonic enhancement through decades of relentless training that had refined his combat abilities into expressions of pure fighting intent that operated according to principles that exceeded normal understanding of how physical power could be focused and applied. His blood demon art, known as Destructive Death, represented fusion of traditional martial philosophy with supernatural capability that created fighting style, whose effectiveness derived from perfect harmony between technique and power, rather than reliance on either element alone. The bare-handed combat approach that defined Akaza's fighting methodology reflected philosophical commitment to personal excellence that scorned dependence on external weapons, while demonstrating confidence in abilities that had been developed through training regimens whose intensity exceeded anything normal human physiology could endure or survive. His rejection of swords and other implements in favor of techniques that utilized only his enhanced body as weapon represented both tactical choice and spiritual statement about the superiority of perfected natural ability over artificial enhancement through manufactured tools whose effectiveness remained limited by their materials and construction. The shockwave generation capability that formed the foundation of his destructive death techniques operated through principles that combined internal energy manipulation with atmospheric displacement, creating attacks that could deliver devastating force at ranges far exceeding normal hand-to-hand combat, while maintaining precision that enabled surgical strikes against specific targets despite the area effect nature of his power projection. These compression waves carried sufficient kinetic energy to shatter stone and metal, while traveling at velocities that made evasion nearly impossible for opponents who lacked supernatural speed or precognitive abilities. The blue coloration that characterized all of Akaza's shockwave attacks served as visual indicator of the supernatural energy that powered his techniques, while creating distinctive signature that marked his presence on any battlefield. Through displays of azure light that preceded impacts by mere fractions of seconds, this blue radiance reflected the purity of his fighting intent combined with demonic enhancement, creating attacks that possessed both aesthetic beauty and overwhelming destructive potential through mechanisms that treated violence as art form worthy of visual perfection. The Soryu-style foundation that provided technical framework for Akaza's martial applications drew upon centuries of human martial development that had been preserved within his demonic consciousness despite the transformation that had altered his fundamental nature, creating a hybrid fighting system that combined ancient wisdom with supernatural capability through seamless integration that enhanced, rather than replaced, his original training. This preservation of human knowledge within demonic power structure demonstrated how transformation could amplify existing excellence rather than simply replacing it with crude supernatural strength. The versatility that characterized Akaza's technique applications enabled him to adapt his fighting style to any opponent or tactical situation through modifications that maintained core principles while adjusting specific applications according to circumstances that required different approaches to problem solving, creating combat methodology that could evolve in real time to counter enemy strategies while maintaining overwhelming effectiveness across a wide range of engagement scenarios. His ability to modify techniques during active combat reflected mastery level that transcended rigid adherence to predetermined patterns. The range extension capabilities that his shockwave generation provided enabled Akaza to engage opponents at distances that exceeded normal martial arts parameters while maintaining the precision and timing that close-quarters combat required, effectively creating fighting style that operated simultaneously at multiple engagement ranges without sacrificing effectiveness at any particular distance. This tactical flexibility made him a formidable opponent, regardless of whether enemies attempted to fight at close range or maintain separation for ranged combat approaches. The defensive applications of his destructive death techniques included shockwave barriers that could deflect projectiles and energy attacks, while creating protective zones around his position that made approach extremely hazardous for opponents who lacked supernatural durability or defensive capabilities. These defensive shockwaves operated continuously, once activated while requiring minimal conscious control, enabling him to maintain offensive pressure while ensuring comprehensive protection against counterattacks that might exploit openings in his assault patterns. The combination techniques that integrated multiple shockwave attacks into coordinated assault patterns created attack sequences whose complexity exceeded what normal human consciousness could track or counter effectively, as each individual strike served both as independent threat and as component in larger tactical configuration that multiplied overall effectiveness through precise timing and positioning. These compound attacks required opponents to defend against multiple simultaneous vectors while predicting follow-up strikes whose patterns remained unpredictable until execution. The psychological warfare potential of Akaza's overwhelming combat display could break enemy morale through demonstration of power levels that exceeded anything normal training could hope to match, creating despair that undermined tactical effectiveness, while advertising his capabilities in ways that discouraged resistance through visual proof of insurmountable superiority. The casual ease with which he could generate devastating attacks served intimidation purposes that often proved as valuable as their direct destructive effects. Yet even Akaza's perfected martial supremacy paled before the ancient mastery embodied by Kokushibo, whose designation as Upper Moon One reflected not merely superior power but achievement of technical excellence that represented evolution of swordsmanship beyond anything human practitioners had ever imagined possible through centuries of refinement that had transformed basic cutting techniques into supernatural art form, whose complexity exceeded normal understanding of how blade and wielder could function as unified weapon system. The moon-breathing style that Kokushibo had developed during his human existence and perfected through centuries of demonic enhancement represented pinnacle of sword-based combat technique, whose forms incorporated principles that transcended normal understanding of how cutting attacks could be generated, delivered, and controlled through methods that treated the blade as extension of consciousness rather than separate tool requiring manual manipulation. His breathing techniques operated according to principles that combined respiratory control with supernatural power generation through mechanisms that amplified human potential beyond its normal limitations. The crescent moonblade generation that formed the signature characteristic of Kokushibo's blood demon art created weapons that emerged directly from his supernatural energy rather than requiring physical materials for the bend. Construction, producing cutting implements whose properties exceeded anything conventional metallurgy could achieve, while maintaining connection to his consciousness that enabled precise control over their behavior during and after deployment. These ethereal blades possessed substance sufficient to interact with physical matter, while retaining flexibility that enabled behavior patterns impossible for normal steel weapons. The unpredictability that defined Kokushibo's crescent blade attacks stemmed from their ability to change size, shape, trajectory, and speed according to his tactical requirements, while maintaining cutting effectiveness that could penetrate virtually any defensive measure through combinations of supernatural sharpness and kinetic energy that exceeded normal physical limitations. This variability made his attack patterns impossible to predict or counter through conventional defensive techniques, while creating tactical complexity that overwhelmed normal human ability to process and respond effectively. The multiple simultaneous attack capability that his blood demon art provided enabled Kokushibo to generate dozens of crescent blades that could operate independently while maintaining coordinated tactical purpose, creating combat scenarios where opponents faced attack densities that exceeded anything normal swordsmanship could produce, while each individual blade retained sufficient lethality to prove fatal upon contact. This multiplication of threats required enemies to develop defensive strategies that could address area effect dangers while maintaining awareness of precision strikes that demanded individual attention. The range extension that his crescent blade techniques provided transformed close-quarters swordsmanship into medium and long-range combat system that could engage opponents across vast distances while maintaining the precision and tactical subtlety that characterized masterful sword work, effectively eliminating the traditional limitation that required swordsmen to close to melee range before their weapons became effective. This extended reach multiplied his tactical options while reducing vulnerability to ranged attacks that might otherwise have provided enemies with strategic advantages. The environmental interaction effects that Kokushibo's moonblades created when deployed in complex terrain included ricochet patterns that enabled indirect attack vectors, while multiple blade techniques could alter battlefield conditions through systematic destruction of cover and defensive positions that opponents might otherwise have utilized for protection. His attacks could reshape entire engagement zones while eliminating tactical advantages that enemies might have gained through superior positioning or environmental knowledge. The defensive applications of his crescent blade generation included protective barriers that could intercept incoming attacks while simultaneously preparing counterstrikes that utilized the kinetic energy from blocked assaults to power enhanced offensive techniques, creating defensive strategies that transformed every enemy attack into potential weapon that could be redirected against its original source. This defensive to offensive transition occurred without pause or telegraphing that might warn opponents of impending counterattacks. The precision control that Kokushibo exercised over his supernatural blades enabled surgical strikes that could target specific body parts or equipment, while avoiding collateral damage that might interfere with tactical objectives, requiring selective destruction rather than wholesale annihilation, demonstrating mastery that transcended crude application of overwhelming force towards subtle manipulation that achieved precise results through minimal energy expenditure while maintaining maximum psychological impact. The ancient wisdom that informed all of Kokushibo's techniques reflected centuries of combat experience that had been preserved within his demonic consciousness, despite the transformation that had altered his fundamental nature, creating a repository of tactical knowledge that encompassed every significant innovation in swordsmanship that had occurred during his extended existence. This accumulated expertise enabled him to counter virtually any technique through recognition of underlying principles that remained consistent across different fighting styles and historical periods. The tragic irony that defined both Akaza and Kokushibo's existence lay in their achievement of martial perfection through transformation that had cost them the human connections that had originally motivated their pursuit of strength, as their supernatural mastery had been purchased through sacrifice of everything that made such power meaningful, while trapping them in eternal existence dedicated to violence that could never satisfy the deeper needs that had driven their original training. The philosophical implications of their perfected arts raised profound questions about the relationship between technical mastery and spiritual fulfillment, while demonstrating how individual excellence could become prison when pursued without regard for moral foundation that gave meaning to achievement beyond simple demonstration of superior capability. Their tragic fate served as warning about dangers of seeking power for its own sake, rather than as means to protect what truly mattered. And so these masters of perfected destruction continued their eternal demonstration of technical supremacy until they encountered opponents whose strength derived not from individual excellence, but from connections that transcended personal limitation, proving that ultimate power emerged not from perfected technique, but from purposes that elevated individual capability beyond self-serving achievement towards service, that gave meaning to strength while creating legacy that transcended mere technical mastery through impact that measured success in lives protected rather than enemies defeated. The boundaries that separate human from demon become permeable when desperation drives mortals to consume the very essence of their enemies, creating beings whose nature defies categorization within established understanding of supernatural transformation, while demonstrating how the struggle against monsters can itself become monstrous when survival demands actions that violate every principle of human dignity and moral restraint. This blurring of fundamental distinctions between predator and protector manifests most dramatically in those rare individuals whose circumstances force them to literally incorporate demonic power into their own bodies through consumption that transforms them into hybrid entities operating according to rules that neither pure human nor pure demon physiology can adequately explain. Among these anomalous beings whose existence challenges every assumption about the immutable nature of species boundaries stands Genya Shinazugawa, whose unique position within the Demon Slayer Corps reflected not supernatural transformation in the conventional sense, but rather a horrifying adaptation that enabled him to temporarily acquire demonic characteristics through consumption of demon flesh, while retaining sufficient human consciousness to direct these borrowed powers toward protective rather than predatory purposes. His blood demon art, if such designation could accurately describe abilities that emerge from cannibalistic consumption rather than inherent supernatural nature, represented perhaps the most disturbing innovation in the eternal war between human and demon, through methods that questioned whether victory achieved through monstrous means could ever be truly distinguished from defeat. The consumption mechanism that enabled Genya's temporary demonic enhancement operated through digestive processes that had been fundamentally altered through circumstances that remained partially mysterious, even to medical professionals who studied his unique physiology, as his body possessed ability to extract and integrate supernatural characteristics from consumed demon flesh while maintaining sufficient biological integrity to prevent permanent transformation into the very creatures he consumed for power. This metabolic adaptation enabled him to access demonic regeneration, enhanced strength, and supernatural durability through dietary choices that would prove instantly fatal to normal humans, while preserving his essential humanity through mechanisms that remained beyond scientific understanding. The regeneration capability that Genya could acquire through consumption of demon flesh operated at rates that approached those displayed by genuine demons, while maintaining temporal limitations that prevented permanent acquisition of immortality, creating healing effects that could restore devastating injuries within minutes, while leaving him vulnerable to gradual power degradation as his body metabolized and eliminated the supernatural substances that provided enhanced recovery abilities. This temporary nature of his borrowed regeneration made tactical timing crucial for maximizing effectiveness, while preventing over-reliance on abilities that might fail at critical moments during extended combat operations. The physical enhancement that accompanied his flesh consumption included strength and speed increases that could enable him to match demonic opponents in direct confrontation, while maintaining human tactical thinking and moral framework that distinguished his application of borrowed power from the predatory violence that characterized genuine demon behavior. These physical modifications occurred gradually as consumed tissue integrated with his existing physiology, creating transition periods where his capabilities existed between human and demonic parameters, while requiring conscious adjustment to altered strength and reflexes. The durability increase that demon flesh consumption provided enabled Genya to survive injuries that would prove instantly fatal to normal demon slayers, while maintaining consciousness and combat effectiveness, despite damage that should have rendered him incapable of continued fighting, creating tactical advantages that compensated for his inability to utilize breathing techniques that other demon slayers relied upon for supernatural enhancement. This enhanced survivability made him a valuable team member despite his unconventional power source, while enabling high-risk tactical approaches that other operatives could not safely attempt. The power scaling effect that characterized Genya's abilities reflected direct relationship between the strength of consumed demons and the capabilities he could temporarily access, as flesh taken from higher-ranking demons provided proportionally greater enhancement while lasting for longer periods before metabolic breakdown eliminated their effects. This scaling mechanism meant that his tactical value increased dramatically when facing elite opponents whose defeat provided access to power levels that could significantly impact subsequent combat operations, while creating incentives for targeting the most dangerous enemies available. The wooden flesh bullets technique that represented Genya's most sophisticated application of his consumed power emerged after his ingestion of upper-rank demon tissue, whose properties enabled him to merge his temporarily enhanced cells with ammunition to create projectiles that behaved according to supernatural rather than ballistic principles. These hybrid bullets could change direction during flight while seeking optimal impact points on target bodies, creating guided munitions whose effectiveness exceeded conventional firearms through combination of marksmanship skill with supernatural homing capabilities that made evasion nearly impossible. The tree growth effect that occurred when his enhanced bullets penetrated enemy tissue represented blood demon art application that utilized consumed power to create battlefield control techniques whose effectiveness exceeded simple projectile damage through environmental manipulation that could immobilize opponents while creating tactical advantages for allied forces. These rapidly growing wooden constructs possess strength and durability that exceeded normal plant matter, while maintaining connection to Genya's consciousness that enabled tactical coordination and strategic positioning. The entanglement capability that his tree-based attacks provided enabled area denial techniques that could control large battlefield zones while restricting enemy movement patterns through organic barriers that grew too rapidly for normal countermeasures to eliminate effectively, creating tactical scenarios where opponents found their options increasingly limited while allied forces gained positional advantages. These binding techniques operated continuously once established, while requiring minimal conscious control from their creator. The gun integration aspect of Genya's abilities demonstrated how traditional weapons could be enhanced through supernatural modification that transformed conventional firearms into delivery systems for blood demon artifacts, while maintaining familiar operational parameters that enabled utilization of existing marksmanship training. This fusion of modern technology with supernatural power created a hybrid combat system that combined proven tactical approaches with unprecedented capabilities through mechanisms that enhanced rather than replaced conventional fighting methods. The cellular merger process that enabled his bullets to carry supernatural properties operated through biological mechanisms that remained beyond current scientific understanding, as his temporarily enhanced cells could maintain coherence and supernatural characteristics even after separation from his body, while retaining sufficient connection to enable remote control and tactical coordination. This cellular autonomy created possibilities for delayed activation techniques that could provide tactical surprises while enabling complex timing sequences that exceeded normal ammunition capabilities. The trajectory control that his enhanced projectiles displayed enabled mid-flight course corrections that made traditional evasion tactics ineffective while creating attack patterns that could navigate around defensive barriers to strike targets from unexpected angles with precision that exceeded normal ballistic calculations. This guidance capability transformed his firearms into area effect weapons, whose influence zones extended far beyond their apparent range limitations, while maintaining pinpoint accuracy against specific targets. The obstacle navigation feature that characterized his supernatural ammunition enabled bullets to move around intervening barriers while maintaining momentum and supernatural properties throughout their altered flight paths, creating attack options that ignored conventional concepts of cover and concealment, while providing tactical flexibility that exceeded anything normal marksmanship could achieve. This ability to strike targets regardless of defensive positioning multiplied his effectiveness against opponents who relied on environmental protection for survival. The paralyzing effect that his tree-based attacks could inflict upon successful penetration created temporary or permanent immobilization that prevented enemy counterattacks, while enabling systematic elimination of threats that might otherwise have required extended combat engagements to neutralize effectively. These binding techniques operated through supernatural root systems that grew within target bodies while remaining under conscious control that enabled strategic timing of immobilization effects. The power amplification potential that Genya's consumption-based abilities suggested raised disturbing questions about theoretical limits of his enhancement capabilities, as ingestion of increasingly powerful demon tissue could theoretically provide access to abilities approaching those of upper moon-level threats while maintaining human moral framework that would direct such power toward protective rather than predatory purposes. This scaling potential created both tactical opportunities and ethical concerns about methods required to access such enhancement levels. The metabolic limitations that constrained Genya's abilities included finite duration of enhancement effects and potential toxicity from consuming demon flesh, whose supernatural properties could overwhelm human digestive systems that had not evolved to process such biologically incompatible materials. These constraints prevented unlimited power accumulation, while creating tactical timing requirements that made strategic planning essential for maximizing effectiveness during critical combat operations. The ethical implications of Genya's power source raised profound questions about moral boundaries that could be crossed in pursuit of strength necessary to protect innocent people from supernatural threats, as his consumption of demon flesh represented violation of fundamental human behavioral norms, while serving purposes that aligned with highest moral principles. This contradiction between methods and motives created psychological burden that affected both his self-perception and his relationships with other demon slayers. The psychological toll that his unique abilities extracted manifested through isolation from peers who found his consumption-based powers disturbing despite their obvious tactical value, creating social dynamics that reinforced his status as outsider, whose contributions were appreciated while his methods remained fundamentally unacceptable to conventional moral sensibilities. This isolation created additional motivation for proving his worth through actions that might compensate for the disturbing nature of his power source. The biological risks that Genya's consumption practices created included potential permanent transformation if his metabolic adaptations failed to eliminate demonic influence before it could fundamentally alter his essential nature creating existential uncertainty about whether his humanity could be maintained indefinitely, despite repeated exposure to supernatural corruption that had transformed every other individual who had undergone similar contact with demon essence. The strategic value that his abilities provided to Demon Slayer operations included intelligence gathering through consumption of demon tissue that retained memories and knowledge from consumed opponents, creating information warfare capabilities that could reveal tactical plans and organizational structure of enemy forces, while providing insights into demon psychology and motivation that conventional interrogation could never achieve through cooperative subjects. And so the consumer of monsters continued his dangerous dance with transformation until questions of identity and purpose transcended simple categorization of human versus demon, demonstrating that heroism could emerge from choices that challenged every assumption about appropriate means, while proving that moral character remained independent of power source. When dedication to protecting others provided unwavering compass through ethical territory, where conventional wisdom offered no guidance for souls willing to sacrifice their own purity to preserve innocence in others who deserved protection regardless of cost to those who chose to bear such burdens alone. And so we reach the end of our crimson journey through the labyrinthine arteries of demonic power, having witnessed how blood itself becomes canvas for abilities that transcend mortal understanding, while revealing the deepest truths about those who wield such terrible gifts. Each art we have explored represents more than mere supernatural technique. It embodies the essence of souls transformed, showing us how love becomes control, fear becomes multiplication, beauty becomes destruction, and humanity becomes something altogether more complex and tragic. From Muzan's foundational biokinesis to Genya's consumptive anomaly, we have traced the evolution of power that flows like scarlet rivers through veins both human and monstrous, demonstrating that strength without purpose becomes corruption, while compassion channeled through supernatural means can transcend every limitation that mortality once imposed. These blood demon arts serve as mirrors, reflecting the characters of their wielders, showing us that technique follows spirit, while power amplifies whatever essence already dwells within the heart. As you drift toward peaceful slumber, gentle dreamer, let these tales remind you that every drop of blood carries stories of transformation and choice, that even in darkness, there burns possibility for redemption, and that the most profound battles are fought not between sword and claw, but between the competing aspects of our own nature. May your rest be filled with understanding that true strength lies not in the crimson arts of demons, but in the golden hearts of those who choose to protect others, regardless of cost. For in such choosing lies the greatest magic of all.